It's the winter of 1837. In the small town of Kirtland, Ohio, Joseph Smith, the prophet of the Restoration, has just launched a brand new financial institution, the Kirtland Safety Society. His followers believe it will fund the kingdom of God. His critics say it's destined for disaster, and within months, the entire thing implodes, leaving broken trust, empty pockets, and an exodus of disillusioned believers in its wake. How did the prophet end up running a failing bank? Why did members lose their savings while leaders scrambled to defend their actions? And did Joseph Smith truly believe this would work? Or was it a faith-based financial gamble from the start? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most fascinating and controversial chapters in Mormon history. Whether you see Joseph as a visionary, a victim of circumstance, or something else entirely, the story of the Kirtland Safety Society is one that you won't want to miss. So grab your ledger books, keep an eye on your wallet, get ready to follow the money. This is Mormonism Live. And today, we're talking about the bank. So there's the thumbnail, Kirtland Safety Society, Incompetence or Scam. And we'll jump right into our first segment here of what led to the bank's creation. So by the mid-1830s, Kirtland, Ohio was booming as Mormon converts swelled the population from 1,000 in 1830 to 3,000 by 1836. The influx fueled land speculation, with prices soaring from $7 per acre in 1832 to $44 per acre by 1837. And that's important. It's important to know that the bank is sort of come up with in the midst of the church having debt, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also this moment where all the prices are going up, sort of like in this moment of inflation, and houses are hard to find, they're expensive. And so to have property or to take advantage of sort of the rising prices and to make a money off things, the bank sort of comes in that sort of environment.
Yes. So two things that people are doing at this time in order to make a lot of money is to scrape together every red cent they possibly can, whether they can beg, borrow, or steal it, and put it into real estate. That's number one. And number two is to try and buy that real estate on margin. In other words, put as little down as you possibly can in order to buy the biggest amount of real estate, because all of that wonderful interest is going to be yours in just a few months as it continues to grow in value. We went through something similar in the United States. I think it was 2008. And people got left high and dry when the market burst. And all of a sudden now, people who had paid or committed to pay a great deal of money for these pieces of real estate, which they thought were going to continue to increase, all of a sudden now, the real estate itself has crashed and it is worth much less than they owe on it. And the only reason I go through that is because I think that gives the background to what was going on in the United States and in Kirtland, Ohio in the 1830s.
Yep. And I want to note, Dan Vogel is in the audience tonight. Dan, please feel free to chime in with anything that comes up. We'll try to pay attention to the comments and put those up on the screen. I think you're going to add a lot of value to tonight's episode. And things you're mentioning there, RFM, nationally easy money policy. So this is a cultural or national environment that the bank sort of rises up in. Easy money policies. There's plentiful credit. Lots of new local banks. Frontier towns like Kirtland lacked hard currency. By the way, I grew up and went to Kirtland a bunch. I grew up about an hour and a half west of Kirtland, Ohio. Been there numerous times, seen all of the properties on the historical site, been to the John Johnson farm. So I've seen that stuff, and that may play in at least in part in the conversation tonight. Frontier towns like Kirtland lacked hard currency, relying on banknotes and credit. As RFM pointed out, many locals, including church leaders, sought a local bank to provide loans and stabilize commerce. In the fall of 1836, Joseph Smith and church leaders sought to found a bank to support Kirtland's growing community. Most assets were tied up in land. Local bank was needed for loans and currency circulation. And beyond finances, the bank aimed to expand Kirtland as a gathering place, aid displaced saints in Missouri, and spread the gospel to establish Zion. And anything there before we jump into the next section, which is the actual establishment of the bank itself?
Yes, they're going to establish a bank. Apparently, none of them have any banking experience. What could possibly go wrong? Well, nothing, because God is at the helm, and he'll tell them how to do it.
Yep. All right. So October 1836, funds were collected from stockholders. And on November 2nd, 1836, the Kirtland Safety Society Bank was established with Sidney Rigdon as president and Joseph Smith as cashier, of course. The name reflected its goal of supporting agriculture, trades, and commerce while promoting the community's financial stability.
And why do you say, of course, that Joseph Smith should be the cashier?
Uh, because whether it's being the mayor, whether it's being the head of the military in Nauvoo, whether it's being the guy who gets all the women, whatever it is during Joseph Smith's life, you better bet your butt that he's out front being the leader of whatever it is. And so for him and Sidney Rigdon to be in charge makes perfect sense. They're the leaders of the church. It's where the trust is.
But Joseph Smith is being humble here. He doesn't insist on being the president. Instead, he's the guy who has access to all the money.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. One guy gets to make some of the decisions, maybe above the other. The other guy's holding the money bags. Of course, that might come into play later too. We'll see. So agriculture, trades, commerce, while promoting the community's financial stability. We'll see if that held up. I'll just note, this is the stock ledger. You can see at the top there, Cleveland, Ohio, April 10th, 1885. This was the guy who it had been discovered. He had sort of held on to it and made a little writing about this thing being kept. So there you'll see that. He just mentions that essentially he's the one who held on to it or found it at the end and brought it forward. It's the kind of the last hands it was in before it came public. And so here's a couple pages from the ledger book. Most of the pages are like the one on the left. They only have one or two entries on them. The page to the right is a little bit of an anomaly, having sort of everything filled out line by line. Nothing super interesting there. I think they said there was about 200 names total on the stock ledger. These are the folks who would have bought the stocks.
I wanted to mention just two things that I learned from Dan Vogel's fine book. First is that, like I said, these people really didn't have any business setting up this bank this way, but they know each other. So what they end up doing is, well, the way it should be done, of course, is that you actually get real money, gold and silver, in exchange for the stock certificates, which are at the same value as the stock certificates you're buying. Instead, they allowed many of the people to buy the stock certificates on extreme discount with the promise to pay the rest of it at a future date. Some were actually, just allowed to be taken with the promise to pay the entire amount at a future date. So what they end up doing right off the bat is they're underfunding with gold and silver the bank compared to the amount of stock that they have issued at large.
Yep. And there's one more page of the stock ledger. So there's that.
That's pretty handwriting.
It is. And by the way, the stock ledger, it's believed, this will come into play later too, folks. You'll want to remember this, but guess whose handwriting the stock ledger is in?
Is it Lucy Smith?
No, it's Warren Parrish.
Warren Parrish. Yes.
We'll get to him later. So
yes. Right before he got shot by Jack Ruby, he was heard to say, "I'm a patsy."
Yeah. All right. RFM, do you want to read the red underlined section here? We can talk about this one for a moment.
The Society's Constitution, remember, this is the bank. The Society's Constitution and Articles of Agreement set the capital stock at $4 million and divided that amount into 80,000 shares of stock sold for $50 each. That was optimistic to the point of absurdity.
And it was absurd because you look down at the footnote there. This is from the Joseph Smith papers, by the way. Notice the footnote. The Society's capital stock was considerably higher, a higher amount than any other community banks in that period, which ranged from 100,000 to 300,000. And we'll see later the church has to alter this or edit it to even start to think they might get some sort of approval for a charter in order to establish the bank. And so this was, I believe, the Articles of Agreement, and this was part of the writing on those. So it just has the date on there. It looks like maybe November 2nd, 1836. Minutes of, I don't know, meeting.
Yeah, minutes of meeting of Kirtland Safety Society. That's Warren Parrish's handwriting?
Most of the writing on the stock ledger is, I'm not sure about the articles of agreement, so we'll get to those. This is the Kirtland Safety Society Constitution. Constitution of Kirtland Safety Society Bank, 2nd November 1836. I think that's the front side of this here, where that's the writing on the back. And we could go through those. I don't think it's really useful. It's sort of just standard lingo, I think, that people would use if they were trying to establish sort of a frontier bank. And we're using that term lightly. I think the church, when they originally start this idea, they think they actually are going to be able to start a bank. It just so happens that the financial times turn swiftly, and it becomes really difficult to get a bank approved, to get a charter approved to start a bank, in terms of getting it approved by the U.S. government or state government. And the inability to do that forces the church to do something different, which we'll get to in a moment. But the articles here are, for the most part, worded in a way that I think any other frontier bank would have something very similar. You're welcome to freeze the screen, pause it, take a look, read those. Is there anything here that stood out to you?
No, I was just thinking that what's going to happen is that because they're not allowed to get the license that they need to practice to have a bank, it's going to force them to do something else, is what you said. And I said, yeah, that force them to do something like, oh, I don't know, break the law.
Yeah. And that's what they do.
It doesn't force them to break the law. They could not break the law. They could say, well, I guess we didn't get the license for the bank. And I know I'm not using the right word, but basically the state legislature has to give them that. And so I guess we don't have a bank. But no.
Yeah. And then these are the articles of agreement for the Kirtland Safety Society Bank, anti-banking company. I'll just note again, I don't think there's anything super crucial in here either, other than the very first go of this. It is called the Kirtland Safety Society. It is referred to as a bank. So there's those. There's the next set of them, and there's the last one. So I'll just turn it back there for a second if you want to pause it.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that what happens here with this bank and how it goes belly up in spectacular fashion to the loss of the fortunes of so many people in the church who invested in it, believing that this is God's bank and that it is going to do nothing but prosper them financially. This was the huge falling away, the huge apostasy that occurred in the church. There were so many things that happened in those 14 years that Joseph Smith is the president of the church from 1830 to 1844, and so many things that happened that are huge things that could cause apostasy. This was the biggest, is my understanding, insofar as the number of people, including leadership, including apostles, leaving the church and fighting against it and trying to overthrow Joseph Smith. It was all because of this Kirtland Bank or Kirtland Safety Society. Just a explosion that happens here. And by the way, as a member of the church, in church, my recollection is I don't hear a lot about 1837. And I don't hear a lot about the Kirtland Bank, except maybe just in general amorphous kind of ways that something happened and it went down the tube and everybody else's bank went down the tube because there was a general depression. But beyond that, really not very much.
Yeah, very much the case. So on the back of those articles of agreement, the very last part is a statement by Joseph Smith. This I do want to read. Do you mind reading this, RFM?
Sure. In connection with the above articles of agreement of the Kirtland Safety Society, I beg leave to make a few remarks to all those who are preparing themselves and appointing their wise men for the purpose of building up Zion and her stakes. It is wisdom and according to the mind of the Holy Spirit that you should call at Kirtland and receive counsel and instruction upon those principles that are necessary to further the great work of the Lord, and to establish the children of the kingdom according to the oracles of God as they are had among us. And further, we invite the brethren from abroad to call on us and take stock in our safety society. And we would remind them also of the sayings of the prophet Isaiah contained in the 60th chapter, 9th, 11th verses, as follows. Surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, and to bring thy sons from far, their silver and their gold, not their banknotes. Now that's a parenthetical comment that Joseph Smith makes in that, because he's taking Isaiah and applying it to their current circumstances. He doesn't want banknotes. He needs specie. He needs SPECIE, and he needs it in silver and he needs it in gold to give backing and reserves for the bank. So he doesn't need banknotes. He needs the real McCoy, silver and gold, with them unto the name of the Lord, thy God, and to the Holy One of Israel, because he hath glorified thee. And then he goes on to quote the second verse. For brass I will bring gold, and for iron I will bring silver, and wood brass, and for stones iron. I will also make thy officers peace, and thine exactors righteousness. Also 62nd chapter, first verse. For Zion's sake will I not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until the righteousness thereof go forth as brightness, and the salvation thereof is a lamp that burneth. Joseph Smith Jr., I got to tell you, when you write stuff like this, you know, I get the overwhelming impression that if I were a member of the church back then, I would be thinking that God was totally behind this. And God had even prophesied of it in Isaiah, for crying out loud, of this very day and of this very institution. So how could it possibly fail?
Yeah, and I think we should spend a moment here sort of expounding on that, which is we'll get to a later part of this show where we debate based on various comments coming from various people in and out of the church that speak to whether Joseph Smith implied that the Kirtland Safety Society Bank had the sanction and power of God in its development. And apologists, Fair Mormon and the Interpreter Foundation and folks like Jacob Hansen or Ward Radio, if they were even half informed on issues like this, would want to posit the argument that, you know, this is just Joseph Smith starting a bank. This isn't him acting as a prophet. And even if he is acting as a prophet, Joseph made some comments somewhere that the success of the bank was going to be dependent on the righteousness of others. And I'll just state here, as you're pointing out, it clearly looks to me, if I'm a believer in the church, that God's behind the bank and God expects me to bring my coinage to buy stock in this bank because it's going nowhere but to the moon, baby. It's like GM GameStop. I forget what the acronym for that is, GME or GMC, but GameStop from the stock market a few years ago. This is sort of the idea. Everybody in the church thought this was the fastest way to wealth.
Absolutely. Everybody knows it. Everybody's doing it inside the church, outside the church. If you can, you're buying up land. And, you know, God's putting his imprimatur of authority on it. By the way, this is an additional reason that this strikes me as claiming God is behind it. Is because there are three verses that I see being quoted, or three passages over here on the right side. The first one is from Isaiah 60, 9th and 17th verses. Okay, so that's 9th and 17th. But they both have to do with the silver and the gold, right? So that makes sense. So he's going to say, bring your silver and your gold so we can get some specie and reserves on this bank. The second one at the top of the last paragraph does the same. It talks about bringing gold and silver, right? But this last verse, which Joseph Smith includes at the end, where he says also 62nd chapter of Isaiah, first verse, this verse has nothing to do with gold or silver. In other words, it's not being quoted by him in order to support this idea of bringing in the reserves and buying the stock so the bank can be a success. He is reaching out to 62 verse 1 of Isaiah, apparently in an effort to show that God is behind the bank. This is what he quotes it as saying, for Zion's sake will I not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until the righteousness thereof go forth as brightness, and the salvation thereof as a lamp that burneth.
And I'll just say, before we go to the next slide, that religious con men all throughout time make incredible claims, and then when those things don't happen, when something fails, there's always someone else to put it on. There's always some reason to say that it wasn't exactly a promise. And you and I have been talking all week long that this entire episode, this episode all by itself, and this was your insight, this episode all by itself of the Kirtland Safety Society Bank can show multiple examples where The person in charge is Joseph Smith. And for one reason or another, instance after instance, it becomes, when things don't go right, it becomes someone else's fault. And I'll just say that for every person listening, many of you have left the church, you're frustrated, you feel betrayed. Imagine how you would feel if you were manipulated into taking your life savings, putting it into this bank, and then this bank doesn't make it when you thought that this was the true and living church led by a prophet and that God had put his stamp of approval on this brand new financial institution.
So lots of people were losing everything in this upturn of the market, but a lot of Mormons were feeling like they had received assurances and promises of some sort or other, direct or indirect, express or implied, that this would be safe. And that also impacted their belief in Joseph Smith as a prophet. And many left the church.
Yeah, and Vogel's just saying that they all started buying on credit,
Yep.
sure of their wealth, and when it failed, they lost everything. So there's that. Okay. Joseph Smith and his brethren were so confident that the Ohio legislature would approve their bank charter that they began preparations in advance. Oliver Cowdery was dispatched to New York and Philadelphia to purchase printing plates for the banknotes in 1836 before they had went through the process to get approved. Those engraved plates proudly bore the name, the Kirtland Safety Society Bank.
That's confidence. That's the kind of confidence you have when God is telling you, this is what I want you to do, and you know that God will prepare the way.
It's also the kind of confidence you portray when you want people to think that God's behind it. Don't worry about it. We have this. Oliver, go forward. By early January 1837, even before any charter was secured, the society opened for business and started issuing banknotes.
Wait, is that legal?
Doesn't seem like it. Now, I will say here, in the church's behalf, there are other frontier banks who do similar things, and many of them failed too, by the way. But it wasn't legal. But every frontier community had to sort of come up with a bank, and often would put them into place at this time before they actually should have, before they had the legal T's crossed and I's dotted.
That paragraph is actually almost misleading when it says even before any charter was secured.
Yeah,
It almost implies like there was one.
Yeah, there was no charter secured at any point.
Never got a charter. And that's
No.
what I was thinking of, not licensed charter.
Yep. But they started issuing banknotes, and they were exchanging their own notes for other banks' notes or giving loans in their notes. Now, that's a great scheme too. If your money's worthless and the other guy's money's worth something, trading your money for their money is a great idea, by the way.
If there's anybody out there who doesn't know this, at this time, there was not a central banking system in the sense of we have uniformity of our notes, our bills, our dollar bills, notes are called, and etc. So different banks from different places, different cities, and would have their own banks, and they would issue their own notes. And their notes, the notes from different places, were given different value, sort of on an informal basis, due to the amount of credit that they were perceived to have. In other words, how much gold and silver they had backing the note versus how little they had. And the more you had backing the note, in other words, the more you felt confident that you could go into that bank, give them a dollar bill, and they would give you $1 in gold. The more confident you were, the greater the value was of that bill, up to $1. I doubt it was over $1. But the less confidence you had in a bank that you could go in and give them $1 and you would get $1 in gold, then the value of that note starts to plummet.
And any scheme like this works great when values are going up, because everyone has confidence that that piece of paper and that coin are going to be worth more later.
Yes.
But if the other thing were to happen, RFM, I imagine that it would hit the fan at that point.
I would say anybody can run a bank when the economy is booming.
Yeah.
The issue is when the other half of the time, right? When the economy is going through a downturn as opposed to an upturn, and banks, in order to be safe, have to be run in such a way that they can prosper in the good times and they don't fall apart in the bad times. They still have sufficient reserves.
Just to note a couple of images here, the picture on the right, the little building to the left. So that says there, this is an 1846 engraving of Kirtland by Henry Howe. The building on the left is the old banking house of the Mormons, and you'll see that it has the similar design to the the house on the left in the right picture, and then the house on the left in the left photo there, that is another rendition of the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. So there's those. Those are sort of what it would have looked like, just a sort of small little standalone building. And then I'll just note some of the notes here. You see Kirtland Safety Society Bank, $1.
The note has been noted.
Yeah. The note has been noted. These would have originally had signatures of Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith. Later on, they would have been stamped. And then at other points,
right
they would have
there.
had.
I see it, Sidney Rigdon, and I see Joseph Smith.
Yep. And then at other points, they would have had other signatures on them, and we'll get to some of that later. Here's another one. This one has, I think, Frederick G. Williams, maybe, and Joseph Smith. So there's that. This is a $2 bill, and I'm going up in increments. Notice this one, the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. They all say that on them. There's other things they say that you're probably not quite seeing, but we'll get to that in a moment too. Look at this one, the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. And you and I know a little secret about how these are edited, and it doesn't even show up on this one. This is one of the original ones that doesn't get edited. So there you go. Will pay on demand. This is the $3 bill, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the $5 bill. Here's the 10, the 50. And I think this might be my last one here. Joseph Smith Jr., Sidney Rigdon. So they don't get the charter. They have to sort of go back and try again. So they revise the Articles of Agreement. So this is the second set of Articles of Agreement. There's not much different. By the way, they're not going to get approved at this point. So they end up changing it.
The hyper-technical way I look at this is saying that when they didn't get the charter from the state to create a bank, which they had to have in order to legally run a bank, they said, okay, no problem. We'll call it an anti-bank.
Yes. So the most significant thing with the revised Articles of Agreement is that they are admitting, because of the name change, they're admitting that they've given up on being able to get a charter. No bank, by the way, I don't think in the year that this happened, 1836 at the end of it, I don't think any bank gets approved for a charter in either 36 or 37, because things start to go south, maybe 36, but in 37, no bank gets a charter. And it's just the state of affairs. The economic downturn impacts everything, and every institution sort of trying to set up a bank, it's just super risky, and nobody does. And so they have to change the name. They have to redo the Articles of Agreement, and this time it'll be the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. They changed some of the titles from Treasury and Secretary to President and Cashier, as we talked about, governance body, the managers versus directors, clarifications of financial procedures, but nothing stands out as anything too bothersome. But really, it's the name change that is the dead giveaway, that they are now just going to go forward with their idea, because they've already promised everybody, to some extent at least, that this is God's idea. And so how can you just throw it in the trash? You have to try. And then here, when revised and put before the government, when they did try to get their charter the next go around, they did lower the price. So instead of asking for $4 million, they went with sort of the high of the day and tried to get $300,000 instead of that $4 million. And so that's just a note of that.
Yeah, they didn't even get the 300,000.
No,
and that was too much too.
No, they didn't get anything close to it. Here's where the story starts to get legally tricky. Normally, to operate a bank in Ohio, one needs a state charter. Joseph Smith and Company applied to the Ohio legislature in late 1836 for incorporation, but Ohio politics were not favorable. The economy was starting to turn, so that wasn't favorable either. The legislature was dominated by hard money advocates skeptical of banks. They blamed unregulated wildcat banks for speculation. And so these would be the banks that don't really have the backing. They're trying to start up, and they're the ones giving all the good banks a bad name. In fact, in that session, the Ohio lawmakers rejected every application for new bank charters. We named that already. Smith and his associates decided, by the way, this is from a faithful place. The notes were gathered and sort of worded this in the way that the notes from the faithful site sort of intimated. So you just notice it has a little bit more of a faithful apologetic tone to it. In fact, in that session, the Ohio lawmakers rejected every application for new bank charters. We already said that. Smith and his associates decided not to give up. Instead, they performed some legal maneuvering.
I have to laugh. Okay.
Please.
Legal maneuvering.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that means breaking the law.
Yep. They reorganized the enterprise as a joint stock company without a charter.
Why didn't everybody think of that who got their bank charters tonight?
This isn't going to go well, RFM. This was destined to fail from the moment Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon thought up the idea.
Somebody thought that was a brilliant idea at the time. And somebody else said, yeah, that is brilliant.
Yeah. They reorganized the enterprise as a joint stock company without a charter. To distance it from the word bank, they renamed it the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. The ironic title was an attempt to exploit a loophole. If they weren't a bank by name, perhaps they weren't subject to banking laws.
That's like the biggest loophole ever. I can't believe nobody's ever thought of that loophole before.
Yeah. The company's revised articles, adopted in January 1837, we just showed you those, spelled out that each member was individually liable to redeem the society's notes in proportion to his shares. So the shares are $50 a piece. They're put up for sale. We'll talk about how those were sold in a minute. But they were put up for sale. And whatever you backed, you gave money to the bank and you bought stock. But now you are now liable in the bank for the repayment of that portion of any notes redeemed. So this isn't like the bank's holding all this money. This is all the people who bought the stock are now responsible if this bank goes under.
You see, and this is being very, very sneaky, because anybody who knows that the bank is not holding silver and gold to redeem or back the notes, right? But actually, they have given the responsibility to pay back the notes to the individual shareholders who you don't even know who they are. And they put it in their the articles. They revised their articles in January of 1837 in order to do that, right? Oh my gosh. I mean, I think this is unethical. I don't want to be mean about it, but it strikes me as problematic.
Yeah. In theory, this meant if you held stock, you were backing the bank notes with your personal assets. A structure meant to inspire confidence.
Yeah, and if you're taking the notes in exchange for goods or services, then what are you doing?
Yeah.
You're getting screwed. More specifically, you think that the bank is backing your note when actually it's somebody else who's a stockholder for the bank, and you don't even know what their economic situation is.
And if this had worked, there would be 1,000 stockholders. Where are you going to find every one of these people if you need to get paid and the other 999 refuse to pay you and tell you it's the 1,000th guy who owes you the money?
I used to wonder why it was everybody hated Mormons.
Yeah, in practice, this setup was shaky. Unlike a normal bank, the Safety Society had minimal hard currency reserves. We'll get to why that was. Much of its capital was in the form of land deeds or simply the promise of shareholders to cover the notes. Pinky swear.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Contemporary observers noted that the Safety Society's founding documents lacked the usual legal rigor. No shit, Sherlock. No actual transfer of property to the company and no enforcement mechanism beyond trust.
Trust is a bad enforcement mechanism, and trust is a bad basis to do business on.
Trust us, we're as transparent as we know how to be. One later commenter said, to a banker, the Articles of Agreement fairly shouted, this is a wildcat bank. Wildcat beware. So this is a wildcat beware, but he means a wildcat bank.
See,
And bank
Wildcat sounds so fun and cool, but actually, I think it means it's an illegal bank that is there to try and make money for probably the people who've created the bank. Don't forget, bank is not just a service to the community. It's also a means of enriching the people who are the owners and the officers of the bank.
it's like the cryptocurrencies that Tom Brady got behind or Hawk Tua got behind. Yeah, don't ask RFM. You can look that one up on your own time. Turn off
How
your
do I
safe.
spell that?
HAWK space TUA. But
Okay.
there are all these cryptocurrencies that come out. They're released to the public. It's usually some famous person who gets behind them. Everybody buys some, and then the people on the front end sell theirs off, making lots of money. The
Hmm.
cryptocurrency crashes, and then nobody here ends up with anything. Um, so a Wildcat Bank was a risky, unregulated bank apt to fail, and critics felt the Kirtland Safety Society fit the bill. Crucially, to use the banknotes already printed with Kirtland Safety Society Bank, the society literally stamped the additional words onto them. Tiny little print. Guess what? You probably didn't see it earlier when we showed you the notes.
I wouldn't have. It
Mm-mm.
is so tiny. It's like they're trying to pull one over on you.
Yeah, it looks like it. And we'll get to that here in the next slide.
So they
Uh,
have the original thing, which wasn't the anti-banking company because they got the actual plates before they got denied their charter.
and they don't have enough money to get new plates. That should have also been assigned to anyone who even saw the anti and the INGCO at the end. But anti banking company was added so that on close inspection, the title read Kirtland Safety Society Anti Banking Company instead of bank. And this was done with two stamps. Somebody notes, I'm not sure if it's in here, but somebody does note that the certificates, the Kirtland notes, are printed off of a press, but then the anti and the INGCO are stamps put on each of the bills.
Yeah.
So here you'll see Kirtland Safety Society Bank.
Yeah,
But if
look
you
at that.
look,
Look at that. Right between society and bank.
it's
Anti.
they couldn't even make it any smaller, and it's
Well,
already
it has
covering
to
up part of the
fit.
Y and the B.
I mean, it does have to fit. Just thank goodness it wasn't a long word instead of anti. It was anti-disestablishmentarianism that they had to squeeze in there. That would have been difficult.
That would have been tough. So you get anti between society and bank that's stamped on, and you get ing-co dot at the end there, or ing-co dot, and that's it. And then that makes this not bank bills. These are anti-bank bills.
The
At
thing
that
is that it's amazing when you look at it because if I didn't know it was there, I wouldn't see that. I would
No,
think this is a regular bank bill.
look at that. When's the last time you looked at one of your dollar bills close enough? No. So there it is. The anti-banking company and their reused notes. Here's another one, Kirtland Safety Society Bank. There's anti and there's the ING co, but you
Oh
can't
my
really see them.
gosh. There they are. It's like, where's Waldo?
There it is. It was a clever workaround, though some saw it as deceptive. The
Who
notes
would
look
see it as deceptive, Bill? Who would
uh,
be so cynical as to see
uh,
that as deceptive?
this thing was destined to fail from the moment it was thought of. The notes looked like almost any other bank's currency at a glance, and only a careful reader would notice the awkward anti-banking qualifier. A local paper, Riley observed, and we'll show that paper later. A local paper, Riley observed that the notes on casual examination appear to read like a bank bill until you spot the fine print, calling the whole affair a most reprehensible fraud on the public. By the way, I think that's the Painesville Telegraph.
Hmm.
At least there's an honest newspaper in town. Legality aside, the operational model of the society was straightforward. It functioned like a bank. It took capital from stock purchases. So stocks were sold for $50 a piece. We'll get to that in just a moment. And so people in the community, under the encouragement of Joseph Smith, using spiritual wording, rhetoric, and threats, highly pushed the saints in Kirtland to buy the stock so that the bank would have some financial backing. The stocks were for sale for $50 each. Some paid in cash. We'll get to how much cash. Some in land, and other in assets. Now imagine you put your land up to back these certificates, then somebody wants to cash out, and the bank doesn't have any money. What happens? You lose your land. And they issued loans to participants, not in gold or in US dollars, but in its own printed notes. So when you bought a $50 stock, you now had $50 in notes to use that had the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company stamped on the front. And you could now go out into the community and use those at the general store, use them to buy land, use them to purchase anything. The hope was that as long as people trusted the note's value, the arrangement would work. Joseph Smith and other officers even sent out agents to spread the Kirtland notes far and wide across Ohio into neighboring states to increase their circulation and usefulness. And he means by usefulness, this means by usefulness that if you spread the notes around and other people have them in their hands far away, that maybe people start to sense like, oh, this Kirtland bank, its notes go pretty far. So my Frontier bank just failed. So I'm going to head to Kirtland and see if I can do business there.
Or you're so far away you haven't heard the bad news about the Kirtland anti-banking company.
Yeah, that would be the notes handed out after the bank began to fail, or the notes handed out before the bank began to fail. But yes. Do you want to read this one?
Sure. In February 1837, just weeks after the bank opened, a local grand jury took action. A resident named Samuel D. Rounds swore out a complaint against Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon for illegal banking. In other words, violating that part of the law that says you got to have a charter in order to operate a bank. A preliminary hearing in March 1837 was held. It was postponed. Legal pressure was building. The society's notes were technically void in the eyes of the law, and everyone knew it. Detractors made sure to point out that any debts paid with Kirtland notes might be uncollectible in court. It wasn't just Gentile outsiders raising concerns. Within Kirtland, some church members grew uneasy as the months went on and problems emerged. A number of prominent Mormons who initially supported the venture later felt it had been a mistake, especially as their personal losses mounted. As we'll see, the bank's struggles led to a crisis of faith for many.
Again, imagine you're in town. You live in Kirtland, Ohio, and you're watching all of this unfold. The gossip in town has got to be horrible. All the non-members have got to be going like, don't touch that stuff with a 10-foot pole. And you have a few people who sort of have aligned themselves with the Mormons, and they're using this currency. Many of the members are using the currency, and everyone feels like they've been told that this venture has God's approval, sanction, and power behind it. Imagine how you're going to feel being presented it in that way, and then finding out that you've been tricked and that this actually is going to fail, and God doesn't seem to be doing anything about it. So there's that. And so now,
in a sense, this is an early form, or could be seen as an early form of affinity fraud.
yes, yes. I'm trying to. The reason I'm pausing is I'm trying to think of the guy's name. Who was the guy famous? Made so many millions and millions of dollars.
Bernie Madoff.
Yep, that's who I'm thinking of. And so it's sort of along the lines of that. You claim to be doing one thing, put a tiny little stamp on the bills to signify something else. It's so small that no one's noticing. You put God's provision behind it, and it doesn't really have any of the ability to last. And I just want to note too, for folks who are listening, again, apologists want to place the blame. They really do need to place the blame somewhere else than the Mormon God and his prophet Joseph Smith. And so we'll get into all the ways in which that sort of happens going forward. But I want you to notice from the very beginning how many things were screaming out loud that this bank had zero chance to make it. And then anytime in your life, if you're a believer who happens to be listening, anytime in your life you go to Fair Mormon to read an article on this, or you go ask questions, notice the excuses that are given in light of the evidence that you're going to see on the screen tonight. So there's that.
And can I also say that if the church had just followed the law, they would have ended up a lot better because they wouldn't have had this huge debacle with people losing their shirts.
He's always got a scheme, by the way. We talked about this in the beginning. I mean, first thing is there's gold plates, and he's involved in the treasure digging, and there's sort of this environment where people align themselves with the treasure digger before the plates to find Spanish bullion or gold treasures in the earth, and they sink further, and the guardian spirits don't let him have the gold, but he gets paid to do it. And then he gets the Book of Mormon and he goes to try to sell that. He borrows $5,000, mortgaging Martin Harris's form in order to print, $3,000 to print 5,000 copies, I believe. And because I think there were 75 cents a piece cost. And that doesn't work. Scheme after scheme after scheme is Joseph Smith trying to figure out how to get rich. But rather than the low life that we all know somebody who tried really bad get rich schemes one after another, didn't work. But Joseph Smith's always have the sanction of God. So rather than having to sort of suffer his own lack of ability to carry out his scheme, he's always able to put it in Heavenly Father's mouth and get other people who have aligned themselves thinking this is the one true church to reach into their pockets and give Joseph Smith money. Anytime the prophet asked for money from people in the community, they gave it to him. And there are numerous references of Smith owing somebody here and running down the street and asking so-and-so to get the money to cover that. And because you're the prophet, because this is the true church, you always have the ability to manipulate people into getting your money. And by the way, has much changed? Look at the church today with $293 billion of your dollars, folks. Amassed wealth that a church has that you'll never get to see the fruits of. You'll never get it, and you'll never get to see it used in ways that would benefit you at all. It was a money-making scheme too. And anyway.
I've mentioned this before, Bill, that it does seem, unfortunately, that every time the church is faced with a choice to make between the welfare of its members and its image as an institution, it will always choose its image over the welfare of its members. And we've seen that time and time again. I don't recall ever seeing a time where they went the opposite way of that. And I was thinking here, a similar thing is kind of going on. And that is that legal pressures building, outsiders raising concern. Within Kirtland, some church members are growing uneasy, right? When it comes to finances, the church, here it is, the law, okay? When it comes to a choice between following the law and doing what the church wants to do financially, the church seems to have a pattern of not following the law. I finally got to it. That was it. Because this really is the same kind of thing as we saw recently with the Securities and Exchange Commission fiasco that the church was involved in. They wanted to keep their assets secret. The law did not permit them to do that. So they violated the law. Here they wanted to set a bank in Kirtland. The law didn't allow them to do it. No charter. Okay, we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah. When God tells you to do something, it's really hard to go, hey, God, they won't let us have that charter. Maybe you could do something about that. No, just proceed. Okay. Within the church, initial enthusiasm for the Kirtland Safety Society was high. Many saw it as inspired or at least provident. And I just want you to notice the following statements. So under the date of January 6th, 1837, Wilford Woodruff, future church president, prophet, seer, and revelator. Remember the 1890 manifesto? This is he recorded in his journal, quote, I also heard President Joseph Smith Jr. declare in the presence of Frederick Williams, David Whitmer, Samuel Smith, Warren Parrish, and others in the deposit office that he had received that morning the word of the Lord upon the subject of the Kirtland Safety Society. He was alone in a room by himself, and he had not only heard the voice of the Spirit upon the subject, but even an audible voice. He did not tell us at that time what the Lord said upon the subject, but remarked that if we would give heed to the commandments the Lord had given this morning, all would be well. Wilford Woodruff's Journal, January 6th, 1837. Whether this constituted a prophecy of success is debated later, but at the outset, believers took it as a positive divine endorsement of the bank. When you combine this with that earlier statement printed in the local paper that Joseph Smith added those scripture verses in and the other stuff that we pointed to, it all adds up to everyone being pushed to think this has got God's stamp of approval behind it.
For those out there who don't know how this game is played, whenever there's a prophecy that's made by Joseph Smith or another prophet that doesn't come to pass, the first move on the part of the apologist is try and find any way they can to say that this was a conditional prophecy, usually conditional upon the members doing what they were supposed to do, with the result that obviously, since it didn't happen, the members didn't do what they were supposed to do. Therefore, God and Joseph Smith are preserved.
Yep. Always blame someone else, or as you point out, make it conditional.
Especially if his name is Warren Parrish, but we'll get to that.
We'll get to him. Willard Richards, quote, Kirtland bills are as safe as gold, unquote. That's what Willard Richards said, believing the notes were securely backed by real estate. Warren
I love that picture. It looks like it could be sort of, I don't know, some kind of cigarette advertisement.
Yeah. Yeah. It does kind of look like that. Beautiful cane, by the way. I wonder if that was used later. We'll see. All right. So Warren Parrish, in a letter dated February 5th, 1838, addressed to the editor of the Painesville Republican, wrote, I have listened to Joseph Smith with feelings of no ordinary kind when he declared that the audible voice of God instructed him to establish a banking/anti-banking institution which, like Aaron's rod, should swallow up all other banks, the Bank of Monroe accepted. The Bank of Monroe was the biggest bank, I think, in the area. It was more credible than others. It had been established for some time. And so Joseph was saying, or Warren Parrish is saying, the Bank of Monroe accepted. And
that might have been the one in Michigan.
Yeah, and I assume he got that from Joseph Smith as well. But the Bank of Monroe accepted that the Kirtland Safety Society would swallow up all the other banks around and grow and flourish and spread from the rivers to the ends of the earth and survive when all others should be laid in ruins. I don't think Warren Parrish is pulling this kind of rhetoric out of his head. This sounds
Even though
like
he has left the church by this point, you see. That's the whole thing. He's an anti-Mormon. You can't trust him. By the way, I think that it was Dan Vogel who had said in his book that for a period of time, in order to try and give themselves at least maybe the cloak, if not the actuality of legality, that the Kirtland Bank operated as a branch of a chartered bank in Michigan. And I think that might be the Monroe Bank that they're talking about. And therefore, since that's a good bank because it's helping them out, right, then they won't be swallowed up. Everybody else is going to get swallowed up. Chase Manhattan, everything's going to get swallowed up except for the Monroe Bank of Michigan.
Yeah, and good point, by the way. They had sought to sort of be a branch of that bank. I think you were sort of saying that or hinting at that. They had made an effort to be sort of a subsidiary, a local bank of the Monroe Bank. And I think they actually had some progress made that way. And then the economy turned and Monroe Bank was no longer interested in expanding out. So there's that. I'll just note here, in a letter to the editor of the Painesville Republican, Warren Parrish discusses the Kirtland banknotes. He was astonished to hear that Joseph declared that the bank had $60,000 in specie. Is that what you called it?
I call it specie.
Yeah. And which, again, I know you've defined it 2 times already, but just
Gold,
to be
silver.
clear with the audience. Yeah. It's the actual money that backs up the notes of a bank,
Right.
is that term.
Right. And by the way, just so it's clear, if it's not clear to everybody, the whole thing about this being a conditional commandment, right, is that with Wilford Woodruff, who writes it down pretty much contemporaneously, never ends up leaving the church. He ends up becoming the president. He writes it down in such a way as that it sounds conditional, okay, upon the obedience of the people. And Warren Parrish, who writes down an account of it as not being conditional, has now left the church and is a fresh, hot anti-Mormon by the time he writes this. So those are the different ways that people look at this.
Yeah. And even if you grant it's conditional, you then have to look at all the other religious rhetoric, including that statement earlier by Joseph where he uses the scripture. You have to look at all the other context and ask yourself how much pressure, how much manipulation, how much would each person in Kirtland feel manipulated into thinking that God was behind this completely?
Hmm.
Number
So,
one.
oh, that was number one.
Yeah, number one. And number two is that none of that matters if the bank was destined to fail regardless, no matter what. In other words, if the people were righteous, it would have succeeded, only holds up if the bank actually had some sort of chance to actually succeed, and it doesn't. It is destined to fail from the moment it's conceived.
What I was going to say is, what is the first thing you learn as a young treasure digger, taking people to dig for treasure and saying that you know where it's buried?
Right.
Conditions.
Yeah.
And you set those conditions up at the outset, or at least you learn to, my gosh, so that everybody can know when they're broken. And so I suppose you wouldn't set them all up at the outset. You keep some to yourself because they might be able to follow them if they know what they are. But if they don't know what they are, and you go, you didn't do this in such and such a way. Well, you didn't tell us that. I thought you knew that.
Yeah. And number three, the conditions, I'm just thinking of this now. Number three, the conditions don't matter unless you're going to blame the financial crisis of 1837
Mhm.
on the righteousness, the world's the country's financial crisis of 1837. You're going to blame that on the righteousness of Mormons in Kirtland, Ohio. Uh, that doesn't make much sense. The underselling of the stocks, that's not conditional based on righteousness. That's the financial scheme you enacted the bank with from the beginning.
Joseph Smith is the cashier. He's
The
not
cashier.
an idle observer of what's going on.
Don't forget that, folks. That will come in handy later. Joseph Smith is the cashier. RFM, do you want to read this one? And we'll get to this, by the way. There's a larger story here with Parley Pratt. RFM, I'll let you tell that story when we get to it. But I do want to at least tease out this statement as we start to sort of round out the statements made about the bank being sort of under some divine providence.
Okay. In a letter dated May 23rd, 1837, Parley Pratt critiqued Joseph and Sidney Rigdon concerning the bank, claiming, this is Parley P. Pratt. He's not happy. Claiming he was led astray and caught in the same snare by your example. He's writing this to Joseph Smith, Parley Pratt to Joseph Smith. By your example and by false prophesying and preaching from your mouths, that's you, Joseph, and you, Sidney, by an undue religious influence. For it is this kind of influence which led us to make such kind of trades in this society, such as saying it was the will of God that land should bear such a price, and many other prophesyings, preachings, and statements of a like nature. So
Yeah,
that's all a quote from a letter that Parley wrote to Joseph Smith.
yeah, the undue religious influence. Again, how much manipulation? Parley sees it. He's noting it. He is saying, you guys screwed me over.
Mm-hmm.
You guys manipulated me. You guys used religious rhetoric and religious promises. You threw scriptures at me, and you told me it was the mind and will of God that I get behind this, and you screwed me, you guys.
Yeah, I've got to tell you that this is the point at which Parley Pratt leaves the church for a brief period of time. And I think it's really clear to me. I sympathize totally with him because it seems to me that he really did get screwed over by Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, but especially Joseph Smith. And, Parley Pratt, he's one of the apostles, for crying out loud. He's one of the amazing ones, at least according to his autobiography. And he did all this stuff, But at this point in time, he gets screwed over on a land deal. with Joseph Smith, who's acting on behalf of the bank, maybe, and also on behalf of himself. And we'll get to that here in a bit. By the way, I had never heard of this story before. And the only reason I ever heard of it before this tonight is because my first missionary companion in Japan, who's now the church historian, Kyle McKay, had mentioned it in a talk. And I think it's the same talk where he mentions that there's compelling reasons to doubt the truth of the church. But he says that Parley Pratt got upset with Joseph Smith, and he probably saw himself as having a good reason. But he doesn't say what those reasons are. But he says that later on he tried to take John Taylor with him, and John Taylor says to Parley Pratt, he's still a prophet of God. And so he got Parley Pratt back on the right track, and Parley comes back to the church. But I thought, I haven't heard of this story. And I wonder why it is that my first missionary companion isn't mentioning the reason that Parley left the church. And why it was that Parley Pratt, so faithful, so devout, would get so upset with Joseph Smith as to leave the church and write a letter to him accusing him of this kind of stuff. Yeah, you don't hear about that in Sunday school, but we will tonight.
Sounds like Parley had compelling reasons to doubt as well.
Oh, yeah. The amazing thing is he came back, but he did.
Yeah, a few people do. There's a whole podcast full of those, all 111 of them, to various degrees. That should make everyone feel better. Some people do come back. I'll just note here, and you and I were talking about this before the show tonight. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but Doctrine and Covenants 111, received in August 6th, 1836. Verse 5, again, this is just before the bank starts. This is a revelation in connection to Joseph Smith sending a group of the men to Salem, Massachusetts to go dig in the cellar of some house where there is gold and silver, some sort of treasures buried in the cellar of the home. Of course, they go and nothing's there, and it's completely empty. And it seems so strange to me that Joseph even sends them on this. There has to be some part of a story that none of us know to this day, because it's so risky to send people out to find a thing that you have no actual real grasp that something is actually there.
Yeah, we don't know that it was necessarily a technical money dig. In other words, digging, but it sure could have been. And it's so exciting in the middle of 1836 to still see Joseph Smith engaged in his boyhood endeavors.
Yeah. So verse 5, concern not yourself, because the church is in debt at this point.
Yeah.
Concern not yourselves about your debts, for I will give you power to pay them. So he sends them to Massachusetts, to Salem. This endeavor fails. They come back, and immediately, the next idea is the bank. So once again, verse 5 in D&C 111 implies that sooner or later, God is going to put forth the answer to this problem. Little did the church know it was in 13 dummy companies when this prophecy would be fulfilled.
Very, very good. Yes, good point. I remembered what I was going to say earlier, which is that we have seen this whole excuse about the members, and we see it over and over. It's not like Joseph Smith came up with it. It's been around forever. But whenever God gives a prophecy that God can't get around to fulfilling, then you got to blame the members, because it's always their fault. They're always screwing up something, and they know it too. So we saw this with the bank, Kirtland Bank. The members will be blamed for its failure. And down in Zion, in Missouri, the members will be failed for being thrown out of the county and not being able to go back and retake it.
And then you get Joseph Smith himself. And this is after the bank had failed. Joseph says, I had always said that unless the institution was conducted on righteous principles, it would not stand. And I'll just note that's human beings are always going to be human beings. And somehow God never learns the lesson. The Zion's March, the saints are supposed to be able to build a temple in Missouri and stay there.
Yeah.
There's all these moments where God's like, well, I told you guys, if you could just behave better. And it's like God never learns that even his own very people can't make good choices as a large group. and he never learns the lesson. God is constantly having to relearn this lesson, banging his head into the wall, expecting different results.
He keeps thinking we're perfect.
Yeah. So Joseph Smith says that, sort of going like, hey, it's
Did
not
I
my
mention
fault.
that? I love this. Okay. Now, this is what hits me is that Joseph Smith, I think it's in June of 1837, right? When he steps aside, he's not going to be the cashier anymore. And Sidney Rigdon is going to step aside and not be the president anymore. Instead, they're going to stick in some other people. Now that under their leadership, this Kirtland Safety Society is crashing and burning, it's time to jump off the ship and put some other people in there as the captain and the bosun's mate. And who is the president?
Warren Parrish.
Was he the cashier?
I don't know. We'll get to that in a moment, but
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I getting ahead of you?
that's okay. He's one of the top leaders of it.
He's one of the signatories. Yes.
Yep.
So what's going to happen now is that here's Joseph Smith. Okay, I'll just say this much right now. Okay, here's Joseph Smith, who was the cashier of the damn thing for the entire period of time when it's crashing and burning. He jumps off, puts somebody else in that position, and then he writes an editorial saying, "Yeah, I don't have anything to do with those with those notes, okay, from that institution, because I always said that it would founder unless it was run on righteous principles." Well, who was running it, Joseph? You were running it. You were the cashier, damn it. And now you're trying to blame somebody else?
Yeah, it's almost like he's on the Titanic and he runs faster than everyone else, beats the women and children, gets to the lifeboat and jumps on and lets it go because he's getting as far away from that sinking ship as possible.
Yeah, he's the guy in the woman's dress.
Yeah, there you go. So what led to its failure? However, storm clouds were on the horizon. Nationally, the U.S. economy was on the verge of the panic of 1837, a major financial crisis. In 1836, President Andrew Jackson had issued the specie, and again, I might be saying that wrong, circular requiring land purchases in gold and silver, and British banks raised interest rates, moves that tightened credit and undermined the speculative bubble. By early 1837, land prices, remember in Kirtland, it was $7 an acre. And then it had gone up to $44 an acre. And everybody was thinking they were jumping in on the front end, but what they had not realized that this thing had already passed its peak. And now by early 1837, land prices began collapsing and banks were under strain. This was the unfortunate timing. Damn the unrighteousness of those Latter-day Saints. This was the unfortunate timing into which the Kirtland Safety Society was born.
It's a good thing prophets can see around corners.
Good thing. Faithful saints invested their savings and trust into the society, expecting it to help build a prosperous Zion in Kirtland. Painesville Telegraph ran a scathing piece titled "A New Revolution, Mormon Money." It warned that no real assets appeared to back these notes. No property bound for their redemption. We should probably say it here. I think there's a slide that talks about it, but I just want to say it to be sure that it gets covered. They were trying to raise $300,000. That $300,000 was separated into stocks that could be purchased for $50 each. That was the price tag on the stock, except nobody had $50. And so everybody borrowed it essentially to pay. In other words, when they went to buy a stock, they would go to Joseph Smith and say, "I'd like to buy three $50 stocks. I'd like $150 in Kirtland banknotes." And they only had to pay like $2.60 for the $50 note. So they would pay $7 and whatever, 82 cents or whatever it was. And then they would be handed $150 in Kirtland money. And with a promise to pay the rest later or to tie their property to it or whatever other things they did. And so the bank took a small sliver of money in and placed a ton of banknotes or currency out, thinking that as long as good times are in front of us, the whole community doesn't show up at once trying to cash in their notes.
Well, right. And the bank is thinking we'll be clever because we won't be responsible for the full amount of the dollar, the face value, right? The person who bought the stock on the cheap will be responsible for that.
And now the guy running the general store, okay, Whitney, right? The guy running the general store gets one of these $10 notes and he hands over $10 worth of merchandise.
I hope not, because it's virtually worthless going out the door new.
Yeah. And so you can see all the problems that would come from this. It says here, let's see, no property. See, a new revolution, Mormon money. It warned that no real assets appeared to back these notes, no property bound for their redemption, no coin in hand, no responsible individuals pledged for their payment. They seem to rest upon a spiritual basis. God's behind the bank. Don't worry, it's going to make it. The Telegraph bluntly called the venture a most reprehensible fraud on the public, accurate, by the way, and reminded readers that issuing unauthorized paper money violated Ohio law. From a government standpoint, Ohio authorities were definitely concerned. As mentioned, the legislators refused to charter the bank. Moreover, Ohio still had on its books an old 1816 statute. There was a new law put into place. I think 1824 is the year.
I like how it says old, because that's only 30 years before.
Yeah, it is old because it was replaced at the, I think, federal level with a law in 1824 that made it so that people couldn't, it wasn't illegal anymore, but but any notes of a wildcat bank just had no value. But Ohio still had the old 1860 law, 16 statute on the books, and hence they could still punish people for breaking that statute. Unincorporated banking. So while this law was arguably outdated and rarely enforced, it provided a tool for those who wanted to crack down on the Kirtland Safety Society's note issuing operation. By the way, if you're a religious cult, a high demand fundamentalist religion that's just originated recently, and everybody outside of your faith in your community hates you, you probably shouldn't do anything that violates the law, because half the population in town is looking for some reason to throw you under the bus. While this law was large, arguably outdated, we already said that, it provided a tool for those who wanted to crack down on the Kirtland Safety Society's note issuing operation.
I thought you were going to say enter Mr. Denton.
Yeah, I think he comes soon. So these are the Painesville Telegraph articles. I'm not going to stop here and read these, but they are very negative towards the church. Painesville Telegraph was a very public enemy of what the church was doing, and anytime the church did something whereby it could be held accountable or ridiculed, the Painesville Telegraph happily obliged. Here's another one. Notice there, the most reprehensible fraud on the public. Again, you can pause that and read it yourself if you want to. Despite early optimism, the Kirtland Safety Society almost immediately ran into trouble. Again, it's not the righteousness of the saints. It's a perfect storm. There's the nationwide panic of 1837. This meant that people everywhere were rushing to convert paper money into gold and silver. Kirtland was not spared. Holders of Safety Society notes began demanding redemption in specie coins, something the society had very little of. We'll get to that in a moment. The panic also caused the land values to plummet. Again, the land backed these notes, and the land couldn't be sold and replace the value of the notes now. The note still says $5. The note still says $10. And now your land isn't worth shit. What do? You've screwed yourself. This is why banks today do FDIC stuff, is because it sort of puts a safety measure in place that as long as you only invest the $250,000 and as long as the federal government doesn't go under, you're at least going to get your money back, whether it's worthless or not.
And Joseph Smith, on behalf of himself, or at least on behalf of the church, has been borrowing as much money as he possibly can back east for goods, for all sorts of things in order to invest, right? So when you're investing and you use everything you can to invest because it's the best thing ever and it's only going to go up, 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 and then it crashes. Now, not only do you hold a bunch of stuff that's upside down, you still owe all the people that you borrowed the money from in order to invest it in the first place. And they're going to be bringing lawsuit after lawsuit against Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon et al. In order to try and get their money back.
This is why if you run a legitimate bank, at least on some level, whether real or not, we can debate that, but not here, is that if you actually sell the stocks for $50 and you actually take in $50 and you actually put the $50 in the bank vault, or even if you do other things with it in terms of loaning it out, you've collected the amount. If somebody brings in a $10 certificate, you've got $10 to give them. When you sold the $50 in stock, so you had out $50 in Kirtland notes, but you only got $2.26, you don't have anything to pay someone. Now, you might have enough collectively that if normal bank business is happening and only 10 people come in a day to do bank business, you got plenty to cover it. But the moment there's panic, everyone's bringing the notes to the bank and there's no money there to pay them off. It again, destined to fail. Holders of Safety Society notes began demanding redemption, something the society had very little of. The panic had also caused land values to plummet. This meant that real estate underpinning much of the society's capital lost value overnight. Underfunding and no charter. We talked about that at length. I'm going to skip over that. Public opposition and runs on the money. We'll talk about that in a moment. But just to note, half the people in town don't like you, and they see right through the scheme.
Here it is, Joseph Smith.
Say, what's that? Oh, Joseph
The
Smith.
next bolded part.
Yeah.
This
Joseph
is the part I
Smith.
can't get over. It's just amazing.
Joseph Smith warned the saints in August 1837 after the bank was already clearly failing to everyone in sight. After he stepped away from the bank, to beware of speculators, renegades, and gamblers trying to dump worthless Kirtland notes on the unwary, essentially admitting the notes had become of no worth in the community. He didn't do that before he left, did he?
He steps
did that
away in
after.
June, and by August, he's on his high horse, criticizing this non-bank, this anti-bank that he ran into the ground.
Yeah, and then there's internal problems. We'll get to those in a moment too. Here's that art. Here's the thing you pointed to, RFM. Here's the paper. The bank has already failed. It's so clear to everyone. It's failed. And then he puts this in the paper. Do you want to read that?
Yeah, to the brethren and friends of the Church of Latter-day Saints, I am disposed to say a word relative to the bills of the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. I hereby warn them to beware of speculators, renegados, and gamblers like myself, who recently was the cashier until I wised up and got out of there in June, who are duping the unsuspecting and the unwary by palming upon them those bills which are of no worth here. I discountenance and disapprove of any and all such practices. Oh my gosh. I know them to be detrimental to the best interests of society as well as to the principles of religion.
Remember this?
Wow.
Let's see here. Remember this.
That's brassy.
This was on the front end. Look how excited Joseph is to get this bank off the ground. Look how he's thrilled.
Oh, yeah.
Now we're on the back end. And
but can you go back to that last slide too? The bottom paragraph on the last slide, the one before the last one.
Oh, let me go. Yeah. Let me go back here.
There you go. At the bottom there, Joseph suspected the society's secretary and fellow church leader Warren Parrish of embezzling around $25,000. So let me see if I understand this correctly. Joseph Smith is the first cashier with Sidney Rigdon of this bank, and I'm just going to call it a bank, of this bank. Okay. Then in June, he steps out, and so does Sidney. They put Warren Parrish in, and then Joseph Smith starts saying, don't have anything to do with this bank. And by the way, it's all Warren Parrish's fault for stealing $25,000 of this gold and silver specie. And that's why the bank went upside down.
Do you think Joseph Smith is leaving the bank if it still has $25,000 in the chest?
Hell no.
No. The money's already gone.
Can I tell you? I mean, I stated those facts. I think those facts are exactly correct. I didn't argue the facts, but they sure paint a damning picture insofar as Joseph Smith is concerned.
Yes. If he's in charge of the money, the bank fails, he steps aside, Warren Parrish takes over, there is no cash on hand, and Joseph says the notes are worthless. It sounds like somebody got out of the way just in the nick of time with the possibility, I think it has just as much merit as Warren Parrish taking the money, is that Joseph Smith, the cashier, might have taken the money.
Well, of course. I mean, it's Joseph. And unfortunately, we are aware of other allegations against him, like when he has offered to take the hand of certain women who rejected his proposals, like Sidney Rigdon's daughter, Nancy. And she rejects it and actually is kind of upset that he would even think of doing such a thing. And then all of a sudden, he starts calling her all sorts of names. And now she's the horrible person, and she's the harlot, and she's the woman of loose morals who came on to him, and all this kind of stuff, right? So, I mean, that story sounds similar. In other words, Joseph Smith seemed expert at projecting on other people and accusing them of the things that he was doing himself.
It at least makes me think, like the monogamy affirmers. I'll use that term to be friendly, but it's crazy that I have to use that. But the monogamy affirmers, they rest like it's this one issue. If Joseph's not a polygamist, then everything's good.
Yes, that Book of Mormon is gold.
And it's like Joseph Smith has 1,000 other problems that even if he's not the originator of polygamy, the Kirtland Safety Society bank alone is enough reason to have significant doubts and to then critically examine the evidence on all the other issues and then to discover that there's no way in hell that Mormonism adds up.
Yeah, they'll go along with all the apologetics on every other issue. The only issue they won't go along with the apologetics is the apologetics for why it wasn't horrible or an abomination that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. So they'll come up with their own branch of apologetics to try and prove the opposite.
Yep. So, okay. So there's Joseph Smith on the back end of the whole scheme saying the exact opposite of what he said on the front end, which is everybody come into town. Everybody bring your gold and silver. Everybody throw money into this. God is on board. You're going to love this. This is going to be great.
Yes.
And then at the end, it's not so great.
Yeah. By the way, those guys over there who are putting that bank together don't have anything to do with those guys.
Those notes, now that I'm out of there, those notes are worthless. I didn't want to say that a week ago while I was still the cashier, but today, worthless. And you can just see a little part of like, oh man, this ship is sinking. I need to get the hell out of here and look back and point the finger.
I was for the Kirtland Bank before I was against the Kirtland Bank.
Yeah. Joseph Smith Carey. Okay, so this chest is not the chest that the money disappeared out of. This
what money?
The Warren Parrish stolen $20,000 or whatever, 25,000. By the way, that number is not the same across sources. Some said 20, some said 25, and it all seems to sort of go back to Joseph Smith, who gets sort of the rumor started, and we'll see that in a minute too. This chest isn't the chest, but this chest represents the story that you and I have heard numerous times as we've delved into criticisms of Mormonism and apologetics, which is that they didn't have enough money to back the bank. So they put lead and rocks and sand in, or some variation of those three, and then covered them with some coins, some gold coins, to make it look as though they've got all the money. And so we're going to investigate that for a moment and see what was said there.
It's gold coins all the way down. Now, by the way, of course, the people, just like it's gold plates all the way down. It's not like Joseph Smith wouldn't have done this before with the gold plates.
The sealed portion, we have no assurance that the sealed portion is actually fabricated plates wrapped in some encapsulation material. All we know is there's 8, 9, 10 plates on top. And then for all we know, most likely, for all we know, making plates and convincing people with their quality of design was so difficult that getting 8 to 10 plates in, Joseph gave up on making more and created a block of encapsulated material to represent the rest of the plates, which would be very similar to what you're saying here with the trunk full of everything except for the coins on top.
It's an old trick, just like if you have a stack of ones and you put 100 on the top and the bottom and rubber band them so that it looks like you got a huge stack of hundreds. It's the same kind of principle. I will say, however, that these stories are not completely unbelievable, because what we have is a situation where apparently even the apologists agree that this bank was horribly underfunded with gold and silver. And it would make sense that before somebody substantial invested or bought bills from this bank, that they would want to see the gold and silver that was backing it, and that there might be a trunk then that would be shown to them. Now, obviously, they don't have enough gold and silver to show because we know they don't have enough. So it would make sense if they took steps to make it look like they had more than they did.
But as you're pointing out, figuratively at least, the same concept holds.
Mhm.
They were supposed to have $50 a share in that box, and they've got $2.26 for every $50 share. And that doesn't even count any money that is on the streets, tied up in land, tied up in other things. In other words, they give
Right.
people that value in notes, and the next day people can walk into the bank, take their $10 note, and get $10 in gold coin.
Mhm.
So for sure, not all of the money would have been in the bank anyway, and they only collected a small portion to begin with.
Yeah. So not leaving that too far, but and not to be too cynical, but it is possible that people get involved in a bank in order to do good and then realize that they have opportunities to enrich themselves or to help themselves out. I don't know that that happened here. It certainly could have. It would be consistent with the evidence if that's what happened here. But it's also sort of like what happens, I think, with that hotline, that reporting helpline for kids and abuse, right? That if that was put in there originally as a good idea to help out kids, it didn't last long before the potential to help the church out was seen, and it overrode any mission to do any good for kids that might have been there originally.
Yeah. Um, there are at least 1,000 good, solid, rational reasons for which Mormonism is not what it claims to be. And so back to the polygamy denier idea, again, they rest everything on this one issue. There, of those 1,000 issues, now that I'm on this side of things and I think about things from about the church in that rational way and don't give preference to the church and its explanations, any 3 or 4 of them are enough to just bury the church. Book of Abraham, verses of the New Testament in the Book of Mormon. I can pick a bunch. In this Kirtland Safety Society bank escapade, there are 10 alone just in this story that should be deeply bothersome to any believer uh, who tries to place their trust in Joseph Smith and the church that came forward from it, or the 400 other denominations of Mormonism that have broken off and become Mormonism just as much. They have a claim as well.
And this really hit people where they lived in the pocketbook.
Yeah. So the rumor about the trunk being filled with rock, lead, and sand, critic E.G. Lee claimed that Joseph filled the safe of the Kirtland Safety Society with 100 to 200 boxes marked 1,000 filled, and then 1,000, then filled them with lead, rocks, and sand to give the impression that the bank had gold and silver reserves. By the way, this does make sense because they don't, as you pointed out, RFM, they don't have the backing. And how do you create credibility with plates under a cloth is one way in the front end of Mormonism, but in this moment of Mormonism, you do the same thing. It's sort of like covering the plates with a cloth.
Both involve pretending you have gold you don't have.
Yeah. In his book published in 1841, Lee wrote, Joseph Smith had some 100 or 200 boxes made and gathered all the lead and shot that the village had, or that part of it that he controlled, and filled the boxes with lead shot and marked them $1,000 each. Then when they went to examine the vault, he had one box on a table partly filled for them to see. And when they proceeded to the vault, Smith told them that the church had $200,000. Not true. In specie, he opened one box and they saw that it was silver, and they opened a number, and Smith told them that they contained specie, and they were seemingly satisfied and went away for a few days. So he knew which boxes to give them. And those ones had coinage in them, and the rest did not. And all you have to do is just have the top layer or two be full of that, and you sort of push people to get out of the way. Now, again, whether this story is true or not, we don't know for sure. I think it's sort of split down the middle whether this is a fabricated story or not.
I don't know how Joseph Smith gets away with not doing this. Was there actually nobody who insisted on seeing the specie that was supposed to be backing these bills?
You would sure as hell think so, huh? It does seem reasonable that somebody would go, show me the money.
And if that demand were made and that demand were not met, then I would think that word would get around and they would be absolutely worthless from that point on.
Yeah. We just don't have anything other than the statement of a critic and a few other things too. W. Weil, Mormon Portraits, but this is sort of secondhand. This is sort of based on the things that have already come out. So in the bank, they kept 8 or 9 window glass boxes, which seemed to be full of silver, but the initiated knew very well that they were full of sand, only the top being covered with 50-cent pieces. The effect of those boxes was like magic. They created general confidence in the solidity of the bank, and that beautiful paper money went like hotcakes for about a month. For about a month, it was the best money in the country. For about a month.
It looked pretty.
Yeah, it did look pretty. Unless you look close at that anti-banking company. This poem was written in 1842 by Oliver Olney. As gold and silver began to be scarce, they got hold of a quantity of boxes and nearly filled them with sand, lead, old ironstone, and combustibles, and covered it up with a clean coin that darkened the deception beneath. This is neither a rhyming poem nor a haiku. Not sure what kind of poem this is.
Is it supposed to be about Joseph Smith and the Kirtland Bank?
It is specifically, yes. It is. And then Fawn Brody would also repeat this charge in her 1945 biography of Joseph Smith. So this is where it sort of gets some traction.
She puts both of them together, doesn't she, here?
Lining the shelves of the bank vault, they said, were many boxes, each marked $1,000. Actually, these boxes were filled with and lead, old ironstone, and combustibles, but each had a top layer of a bright 50-cent silver coins. And then here we get to the fun story of Parley Pratt. Parley Pratt gets screwed. You can read this or tell the story, RFM. It doesn't matter to me. I think there's some details that are in this writing that would be important to include, though.
Well, this is so bad because here's Parley Pratt, and he comes back from a mission, and he needs some land, and he's in Kirtland, right? And he buys some land at an inflated price from the bank from Joseph Smith, right? Okay. And I say that because it's not always clear when you're buying from the bank and when you're buying from Joseph Smith. That's why.
It's also the same with getting land in Nauvoo. You don't know whether you're getting land that Joseph Smith is personally handing out at no charge to his friends, plural wives, or actual land that the church is selling, doing the business of the landholder and the person managing the estate being Joseph Smith.
Yeah, so here he is. He's got to find a place to live and his wife and everything. So he buys 3 lots of land from Joseph Smith for $2,000. And for whatever reason, he thinks Joseph Smith originally paid $100 for it. And this is part of the incredible, the land stuff going on, right? So now he has to pay $2,000 from Joseph Smith. He doesn't have $2,000. So he signs a note for $2,000, puts his first down payment of $75 for these 3 lots of land that Parley P. Pratt thinks Joseph Smith paid $100 for in the not too distant past, obviously. Okay, so now everything goes bad and he can't make the payments, and he goes to Joseph Smith and, says, hey, we want to take care of this. I don't know if Joseph Smith talks to him, but he finds out from Sidney Rigdon that what Joseph Smith did was he took that note that says that Parley Pratt owes Joseph Smith the balance, the $2,000 minus the $75 payment, takes that and goes and turns it in at the bank and gets money off of it, sells it to the bank, and then tells Parley, okay, it's not between us anymore, right? Now you got to deal with the bank, and the bank is foreclosing on you.
Joseph Smith got paid. He transferred the debt to the bank. He's the cashier and, for all intents and purposes, prophet and president of the bank. He takes the debt to the bank, transfers the debt to the bank, and then takes out the money so that he gets the money free and clear. He gets to walk away. And now Parley Pratt is going to owe the bank a significant amount of money.
Did I get that story pretty close?
Yeah, I think so.
But then John Johnson says, and we don't have to get into that. I hadn't heard that part before about John Johnson, who ends up, he was the president, or he's a major bank stakeholder. Anyway, he starts deeding out some property and trying to take care of the members of the church instead of taking care of the bank or himself. But he ends up saving him. But Parley Pratt leaves the church over this. He writes a very, very hotly worded letter to Joseph Smith. He's furious, and I can understand why. And I have trouble understanding how to look at this in any way that puts Joseph Smith in a good light or even an even light, because he really looks pretty horrible here, what he did to Parley Pratt. But I'm open to other people's views if you have them there in the live chat or in the comments.
Crazy. Then we get to what I thought was mind-blowing. This was, to me, one of the most important moments of this episode. It's the state of Ohio versus Joseph Smith Jr. And so I wanted to give some context first. I think this will help us understand sort of the data points that are about to follow. The 3rd of January, William Smith and Marvel C. Davis were rebaptized into the LDS Church. And there was some comment, I don't know, actually, I think it might even be here. Yeah, I think it's here. The fact that both are readmitted at the same time may possibly indicate some connection between their respective connections to each other from the Mormons. In other words, they were removed from the church together and they've been rebaptized into the church together. And I think that's important because William Smith is the brother of the prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to see in a moment that Joseph Smith perceives Marvel C. Davis as a safe person to ask for a really troublesome favor from.
I got to tell you, I've never heard of Marvel C. Davis before, but he's now my favorite named Mormon in church history.
I knew you were going to do that. All right. On the 27th of March, dedication of the Kirtland Temple, hymns were sung by a choir directed by Marvel C. Davis.
There he is again.
Solomon W. Denton, you mentioned him earlier. The choir was directed by Marvel C. Davis. Solomon W. Denton reported having seen a great vision during the time of the washings and anointings associated with the ceremony. So Marvel C. Davis might be an associate or friend of William Smith, the brother of the prophet. And Solomon W. Denton at the Kirtland dedication had spiritual experiences that he was sure were true that bound him in some form testimony to the church. And he has some degree of loyalty because Joseph, throughout his life, would lean on the people who he could get to have spiritual experiences. If someone had a spiritual experience, 3 witnesses, the treasure diggers, if somebody had a spiritual experience, at least for a short time, he's like, I think I can trust that person a little more than others. They seem to be able to be manipulated into experiencing this thing. And then in the fall of 1836, Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, and Sidney Rigdon established the Brother of Gideon Society. Now, this took me in another direction. I'll just note here, we'll talk about it, I think, on Mormonism After Dark. But the Brother of Gideon Society is a former name, a prior name that the Danites had before they became the Danites. And so maybe we can talk about that on Friday. All right. I'm going to read just the red underline. So on April 13th, 1837, Grandison Newell filed a complaint before Edward Flint, a justice of the peace in Painesville, Ohio, alleging that Joseph Smith had threatened to kill him. Now, let me just tell you who Grandison Newell is. Non-member. He knows the bank is a scheme. What is Grandison Newell? This is the kind of guy I like. This is the kind of thing I would have done in Kirtland on the outside of the church. I would have put a post out on Facebook and asked all of us post-Mormons to buy up as many of these Kirtland notes as we could. And then let's run them down to the bank together and let's get paid. Because we all know that the bank doesn't have anywhere near the backing it's supposed to have. Hence, there is more money on the street in notes by far.
Mm-hmm.
There's less than 10% at best of backed money at the bank, and almost certainly way less than that. Some estimates put it at like 2 or 3%. So Grandison Newell buys as many notes as he can. He's got some wealth. He buys all the notes. and he runs as many of them as he can down to the bank. And Sidney Rigdon, Joseph Smith's out of town for a minute, and Rigdon panics. And Rigdon closes down the bank for a day. Now, if somebody tries to cash out the notes and you respond by closing down the bank, you have told everyone in town you do not have the money to cover the notes.
Right.
Grandison Newell didn't have all the notes. He had whatever, 5% of the notes, 10% of the notes, and he tried to cash out. So can you imagine why Joseph Smith might threaten to kill him?
If I were Joseph Smith, I would be very, very angry at Mr. Grandison Newell.
I'd be pissed. He figured out our scheme, and he's the only guy in town trying to blow it up.
What to do, what to do.
So here's what happens. The most revealing testimonies at the trial come from Orson Hyde. Yep. That Orson Hyde. You know, the guy sent on a mission so that Joseph Smith could bang his wife. That guy. The guy who dedicated Jerusalem. That guy.
It's been going great since then.
Loyal to the church throughout his life. Might have had moments of whatever, but for the most part, loyal to the church throughout his life. What'd you say, RFM?
I was saying Jerusalem. It's been going great since then.
Yeah, it's been going great. The most revealing testimonies come from Orson Hyde and Solomon Denton. Remember that Solomon Denton we just mentioned, who had visions at the temple?
Yes.
According to the Telegraph account, Hyde testified that in early 1837, he had conversed with Joseph Smith and others about the threat of litigation against the officers of the Kirtland Safety Society. According to Hyde, Joseph Smith stated that Newell, Grandison Newell, the guy who bought up all the notes, took them to the bank, and Rigdon panicked and closed the bank down for the day. Newell, this is what Joseph Smith said. Hyde further claimed that Joseph Smith said that Newell should be put out of the way or where the crows could not find him. RFM, what are crows known for doing?
They really like shiny objects. Are you talking about pecking eyes out? By the way, you skipped over the line right before it inadvertently.
Please.
Newell, okay, this is what Joseph Smith says. That Newell, first off, was the only person who might bring such an action. In other words, he said Newman, except it was Newell. Newell must be the one who's doing this. And so Newell should be put out of the way or where the crows could not find him. This is apparently, according to this report, and I want to know where it's from, actually what it is that Orson Hyde is reported to have testified about at the hearing where Joseph Smith is charged with, I guess, attempted murder, or at least trying to bring a conspiracy to commit.
This is the Telegraph newspaper during the trial, reporting on the trial. Of course, there's going to be a employee of the newspaper at this trial making notes, and it comes back and it makes the newspaper.
And how chilling that, of course, Joseph Smith would have to say that such an action would be justified in the sight of God.
Yes. According to Hyde, you said it, Joseph Smith stated that Newell was the only person who might bring such an action, reporting their egregious abuse of the law to the state of Ohio and getting the lawsuit initiated. In other words, he's the star witness for the state of Ohio. Hyde further claimed that Joseph Smith said that Newell should be put out of the way or where the crows could not find him. That is murder talk.
A murder of crows.
Yeah. The Telegraph's account noted that Denton, a former Latter-day Saint who had been excommunicated from the church around April 1837. Notice again how apologists always go, well, that guy's out of the church. I mean, you can't trust him. He's out of the church. But how often is Joseph Smith taking star witnesses to his behaviors and getting rid of them? Oliver Cowdery with Fanny Elger? Who's the guy we did something on where he was claiming to sort of be a prophet himself? You had Brewster, which is one of them, the kid.
Yeah, Brewster.
Excommunicates him. Anytime somebody has something against Joseph just gets rid of them. And then when he gets rid of them, then the apologists go, well, that's a bad guy. He's a critic of the church. He's an excommunicated apostate. You can't trust him. Denton, a former Latter-day Saint who had been excommunicated from the church around April 1837, testified that in April or May 1835, it
We should
says.
wait there because I think that's supposed to be 6. That's why I was
Should be.
looking at when
Yep.
you were talking just
It
a
should be
minute ago.
1836.
Yeah.
Now, he might be, I'm just going to say the Telegraph's account noted that Denton, so this has got to be 1836.
Yeah.
Maybe even 1837.
I don't think so.
Because it's on June 3rd, June of 1837, Flint convened a preliminary examination of the Painesville Town Hall. So I think this is 1837. Dan, if I can just ask you maybe to confirm that,
But it would be 37. You're right. Because that's when, it has to be during that time period in 1837, because that's when Newell is running around and trying to buy up the notes and go redeem them at the bank.
Correct. 1835, the Kirtland Bank's not even an idea yet. Yeah. Testified in April or May, I'm going to say 1837. He and Mr. Davis, remember that? We talked about Mr. Davis, Marvel C. Davis. Okay, so in April or May of 1837, he and Mr. Davis, presumably Marvel Davis, this is the Joseph Smith papers, by the way, had discussed assassinating Newell, Grandison Newell. Denton recounted borrowing pistols and having a conversation with Joseph Smith in which he claimed Joseph Smith encouraged him to kill Newell. So Denton meets with Joseph Smith privately. Smith asks for a meeting. He tells Denton, I need this guy out of the way, and you're the guy to do it. So in a public meet, I don't mean public as in front of everyone. I mean public as in there's a handful of people in the room.
Well, Marvel Davis is the other guy, the second murderer.
Yeah. When Joseph Smith is in the room with a group of people, he makes the comment about the crows and needing Grandison Newell out of the way. That's murder talk, but it's ambiguous enough that you could deny it in a courtroom. Then outside of the meeting, you're shaking your head off him. I'd love to know that.
Well, you'd have to have a very, understanding jury.
Yeah. You'd have to come up with something, but it's not a direct claim to murder someone. It's pretty damn close. Then Joseph gets out of that meeting and finds Denton and asks him to meet privately, and then tells Denton, you're the guy. I want you to take care of Newell. And any doubt of this, by the way, you have Orson Hyde who's testifying at the trial that this is true.
Yeah.
So
this is like a scene out of Macbeth,
So Joseph only tells Denton to, you're the guy, kill him. But Denton needs help. And Joseph Smith and Denton agree that the other guy that should help you is Marvel Davis. So Denton leaves the meeting with Joseph Smith, goes to Marvel Davis and says, hey, you and we're together in this. Prophet wants us to kill this guy. I'm going to read this again. In April or May 1837, he and Mr. Davis, presumably Marvel Davis, had discussed assassinating Newell. Denton recounted borrowing pistols and having a conversation with Joseph Smith in which he claimed Joseph Smith encouraged him to kill Newell. Denton explained that he and Davis decided not to act after considering the atrocity of the crime. By the way, the fact that they didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
If you do it and you want to try to place the blame, you didn't do it. You don't need to place the blame for a murder that never happened. He's saying Joseph Smith told him to do it. And Orson Hyde's testimony makes this add up. Now, Rigdon, again, Joseph met with Denton privately. So what is Joseph Smith's story going to be outside of that private meeting? He's going to deny that he ever wanted this guy killed.
Well, of course.
Sidney Rigdon
wouldn't be very smart of him for it to admit it.
No. Sidney Rigdon testified that he had heard of the plot by Denton and Davis in 1835. See, it still says 1835. And informed Joseph Smith, who had claimed to have no knowledge of the conspiracy. Rigdon indicated that Joseph Smith subsequently spoke with the two men, apparently to enjoin them to desist from their evil course. They had already decided themselves they were desisting from the evil course, but Joseph Smith comes in like the hero and says, "Oh, don't do that."
It was good he was there to talk them out of it. Those crazy kids
who had already talked themselves out of it, right?
They were such chickens. Brock, 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 brock.
I'll just finish this paragraph. Rigdon indicated that Joseph Smith subsequently spoke with the two men, apparently to enjoin them to desist from their evil, according to the Telegraph's account. Other witnesses, let me see here. Other witnesses testified they had never heard Joseph Smith make any threats toward Newell. Of course not. They weren't there, and these guys, nobody said anything out loud outside of this meeting. So there's that. Here's the Painesville
Hyde.
There's Orson Hyde. Here's the Painesville Telegraph that actually reports on this. A suit instituted in behalf of the state of Ohio on complaint of Mr. Grandison Newell against the defendant, charging him with an attempt to take the life of said complainant by inducing two individuals to lay in wait for said Newell near his dwelling in order to shoot him. State of Ohio versus Joseph Smith, alias the Prophet. Mr. Hyde for the prosecution called. He said Smith recounting, threats had been uttered against the bank and its officers. So this has to be 1837 because this whole thing starts with threats against the bank. Threats had been uttered against the bank and its officers, and it was possible a suit might be commenced against them. But said he, Smith, I know of no one who would do such a thing except it is Mr. Newell. Smith seemed much excited and declared that Newell should be put out of the way where the crows could not find him. He said destroying Newell would be justifiable in the sight of God. That
Destroying.
It was yeah. And witnesses said he had never heard Smith use, witness, Orson Hyde, said he had never heard Smith use similar language before. This is the first time Orson Hyde feels like he's heard the prophet act unprophet-like and ask for murder to be taken.
Do murder and calm go together? Calm and murder? Murder?
Yeah. To the question, does Smith claim to be a prophet? Orson Hyde answered, he does sometimes. Solomon Denton called, and again, the years there say 1835, but that doesn't seem to fit the story. And by the way, I'm open to, for whatever reason, the murder attempt is 2 years earlier and is completely unrelated to the bank. But that just doesn't make any sense in light of
a member of the society. That's the society they're talking about. The Kirtland Banking Society, I believe.
Where do you see a member of the society?
It's right there. One afternoon I saw him. Where was it? W.W. Phelps?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Solomon W. Denton called. Witness says that in April or May 1835, he lived with Smith and was a member of the society.
Yeah. At that time, there was much excitement among the members about Newell, his raising a mob, etc. One afternoon, I saw Mr. Davis, who said he wished to speak to me privately. Mr. Denton, this is Mr. Denton. One afternoon, I saw Mr. Marvel Davis, who said he wished to speak to me privately. We withdrew to a private room, and after consulting together about putting Newell out of the way, Joseph Smith's language, according to Orson Hyde, I went to Mr. Cowdery, borrowed a pair of pistols, cleaned and loaded, fired them once, and loaded them again. As I returned, saw Smith, who said he wished to speak with me. We retired to the garden. He said to me, I know where you are going and what your business is. That he had seen Marvel Davis and told him I would be a good hand to go with him. And this was a great work, and we must be very wise. Then spake of Newell, and said he had injured the society, and that it was better for one man to, by the way, look at this. This is Nephi and Laban language. And that it was better for one man to suffer than to have the whole community disturbed. And that it was the will of heaven that Newell should be put out of the way, and that he would take the responsibility for the deed was justifiable in the sight of God and would be rewarded. When we had killed him, he wanted his body secreted, if possible, where only the crows could find him. That's me adding that in because that's what was in the other statement that Orson Hyde said. If this was the kind of evidence that was in favor of the church, the apologists would be holding this up. Orson Hyde testifies, non-members testify. Everybody is saying the same thing. Anybody who is privy to this information is all pointing to the same facts. The apologists would go, if this worked in favor of the church, we would take this in a second. This is not good.
This really is pretty damning testimony.
This would be pretty strong in a courtroom. Now, we'll see the decision in a moment. It doesn't go the way everyone thinks it does.
And of course, Joseph Smith's story is exactly what you would expect from a person who really did do it, but is coming up with an excuse. Now, that's my way of not saying that it didn't happen, but it really is predictable, isn't it? That he found out that these two guys were going to go do it. So he went and talked to them and told them don't.
And then finally here, Smith told him he wished to God that the deed had been done and hoped it would not be given up, that heaven would reward the doers of the deeds so just.
It better be God, because I'm not giving you shit. So heaven's going to reward you, right? You're going to have eternal blessings if you do what it is I tell you to do, even if it goes against what you believe to be right. And of course, he does this with all his polygamy stuff too, doesn't he? By the way, when I say this is the expected lie, this would be the expected lie, is because what he's going to do is he's going to come up with a story that will account for why it is that he is talking to both of these would-be murderers, right? Why does he have to be involved at all? Why does he have to know this is going on? Because he wants to have his story line up as much as it can with the story that's being told against him, including his private meetings and conversations with the murderers, but he will change the wording of it. I don't know why it is, but there is a tendency in people who get caught doing bad things like this to want to make their story line up like this as much as they can and still be innocent, as opposed to just say, I've got no idea what you're talking about.
And for him to throw in the it is better that one man shall perish than a whole nation dwindle in unbelief,
Yeah.
which is a clear sign that using that scripture with a little bit of adaptation, but it is clear that that is the parallel. In that original Book of Mormon story, Nephi, against his better judgment, cuts off the head of Laban in order to fulfill the Lord's will. Pretty big deal. Smith told him that he wished to God. Okay, we already read that, so we'll go to the next
So surely
slide.
Joseph Smith got convicted.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, after hearing testimony, the judge ruled there was sufficient evidence to order Joseph Smith to enter into a $500 recognizance.
So this is not a trial. This is a preliminary hearing to see if there's sufficient probable cause to continue the case. Is
Like a
that it?
grand jury kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
The maximum amount allowed by Ohio statute to appear at the next term of the Geauga County Court of Common Pleas and to keep the peace toward Newell. Flint also ordered Rigdon, Hyde, and Denton to enter into recognizance binding them to appear as witnesses at the trial. On the 10th of June, 1837, Joseph Smith appeared before Judge Van R. Humphrey in the Geauga County Court of Common Pleas. After hearing the evidence, Humphrey ruled, quote, that the complainant had no cause to fear. That's Grandis and Newell had no cause to fear, and Joseph Smith was discharged. Newell was not pleased with Humphrey's ruling and pleaded his case in the local press. Another newspaper, the Painesville Republican, took exception to Newell's attack upon Humphrey's decision and characterized Newell's complaint against Joseph Smith as persecution rather than prosecution.
Sure.
Any thoughts you have there?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what happened at the trial. There's a new judge in town. I doubt that he's in the tank for Joseph Smith, and I'm not sure exactly what that means, where he ruled that the complainant had no cause to fear. I'm guessing that this is, of course, an element of the offense, the criminal charge that was brought. And perhaps the problem is that the plaintiff forgot or neglected to put in any evidence that he was in fear or that he had cause to fear. And therefore, not having proven an element of his charge, the judge dismissed it. So I don't know if that's what happened, but it would seem that if that other evidence that we just talked about that was entered at the preliminary hearing got entered at trial, and if you coupled that with the plaintiff, and that's Denton, right? No, Denton is Newell. This is Newell.
Yeah, Newell is the person selling the notes,
Denton is
Denton
one of the
and
murderers.
Davis. Denton and Davis are the two murderers.
Okay, so Newell, right?
Yeah.
But I
Plotting.
don't know. I have no idea because I haven't seen anything in this to tell me how it was that he became aware, that Newell became aware that this was going on. Obviously, he had to become aware some way. Otherwise, how would he have known to bring the lawsuit in the first place?
By the way, use a little bit of rational thinking. If Denton and Davis are pissed at Newell, in seemingly whether Joseph Smith is involved or not, in seemingly an act to sort of protect the church. If you are Denton and Davis and you are on your own scheming to murder Grandis and Newell, and Joseph's not involved, and you're doing it to protect the church, the last person you're going to blame for hiring you to murder him is Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
It only makes sense if Joseph Smith actually did have the conversation, and I don't have to posit it like it's a 50-50. Orson Hyde said he heard the plot from Joseph Smith's own mouth. Yeah. Somebody pointed that out. This kind of stuff should be in the missionary discussions. People should make informed decisions about whether they, when praying about the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, already have cause to disbelieve the mechanism by which the church wants you to figure out whether it's true or not.
Yeah, this is a very significant find that you've made. I know that you're not the first person to make it, but
Right.
it's the first that I've really heard of it, and or the first I've lived with it and paid attention to it enough to keep it with me, as opposed to sort of reading it through as I'm reading history. This is, I think, is a very significant story, and I think it tells us a lot about Joseph Smith's character.
Yeah. So then we get into the breakdown of judgments against Joseph Smith. And I want to maybe save that because I think we'll get to that here later as well. But Joseph Smith took some losses here too, assuming he didn't take $20,000 out of the box, because that would solve a lot of the problem. It says here the cost of legal judgments against Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were assigned to their agents, William Marks. Remember, he was chased out of town upon Joseph's death, but notice how loyal to the prophet Marks is here. Oliver Granger, for $1,600 in his statement to William Marks and Oliver Granger, Grandis and Newell wrote. So in his statements to William Marks and Oliver Granger, Grandis and Newell wrote, for and in consideration of $1,600 to me in hand, paid by William Marks and Oliver Granger, I do hereby sell, assign, and set over to the said William Marks and Oliver Granger 2 judgments in favor of Samuel D. Rounds, and assigned to me by said Rounds against Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon of $1,000 each, which judgments were obtained at the Court of Common Pleas Holden at Chardon in and for the county of Geauga, to wit, on the 24th day of October 1837, and I do agree to pay all the cost that has accrued on said judgments up to this date. Grandis and Newell acknowledges that William Marks and Oliver Granger have been assigned a $1,600 judgment against Joseph, acting as his agent. And I don't quite know the context of this. I don't know if this is his way of getting paid for the notes.
What's going on here? I did a little background on this. Is that Rounds brought 2 lawsuits against the church for violating Ohio state law, and he won on both of those. And then after that, Newell gets a hold of these notes. He does some interaction or exchange with Rounds. He gets a hold of these notes, and then he reaches an agreement with the people who owe on the notes, which are now in Newell's hands, to redeem them and get them back so that they don't owe anything on them anymore.
Yes, he is getting Ohio to go up against Joseph Smith, and that whole thing works its way out along with his suits. And the church, obviously, and the bank broke the law, so he's deemed judgment. And then the murder case is something separate, and Joseph Smith is found essentially not guilty.
Yes, and there are tons of other cases that will not be resolved, and that will have warrants out for Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon's arrest, and they will flee Kirtland, Ohio, in the middle of the night, I think in January of 1838.
All right. Now, Kirtland Safety Society collapsed before the 1837 market crash, though the crash sealed its fate. We already talked about this. Grandison Newell, a business rival, led efforts to devalue its notes by demanding redemption in coins, draining reserves. Rigdon panic closed the bank for 24 hours. Key investors, including John Johnson. Remember the John Johnson farm. I've been to Kirtland numerous times. You've got Kirtland, Ohio, where the Kirtland Temple is, where most of the saints are, but just a short little drive. I don't know what it is, 30 minutes maybe. You get to Hiram, Ohio. And this is where Morley, the Morley farm, this is where Joseph Smith says, what you see here today is just a small band of brethren, but someday this church shall fill North and South America, shall fill the world. That happened at the Morley farm. And then you've got the John Johnson farm, which was a church welfare site. I went there numerous times and planted and picked strawberries, trimmed apple trees and picked apples, and went through all the church historical sites in those places. John Johnson was a moderately wealthy member of the church. He housed Joseph Smith. He housed Sidney Rigdon. Remember when they got tarred and feathered and dragged through the snow and Rigdon bumps his head a bunch of times? That happens on the John Johnson property. Abandoned financial commitments triggering the domino effect. So key investors, including John Johnson, abandon their commitments. From this point forward, they go, I am not paying back. You made me responsible for the payment of these things, and I will not do that. And the moment the big investors jump out, all the small guys are jumping out. It's over. Any thoughts from you?
No, I'm just loving the story. I mean, I'm loving it because I'm not involved in it.
Say this one. What do you? Yeah. You weren't the one that's up for.
It'd be terrible if you're in the middle of this, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And especially if you believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet, and how much have you sacrificed to bring your family over to this location from wherever it is you've come from, and just believing, and now you invest because you believe, and now you're losing it all, and you have to deny it at first and then realize it, and then you have to decide, what are you going to do with this? What are you going to do with this knowledge that not only is Joseph Smith apparently not a prophet, or at least not have God's aid in running a bank? Okay, we'll make it that specific. That not only is that true, but that you've lost your life savings as a result, and you're still in the middle of it because you still owe to all these other people.
And now we're going to dive a little further into the chest where Warren Parrish is being accused of having taken money out of it. And I wanted you, if you don't mind, if you'll read that.
Yeah, is that Warren Parrish?
That is a picture of Warren Parrish.
It looks like Elton John.
It looks more modern. I was sort of surprised to have found this photo. But if you look up LDS, Warren Parrish, and it's at first I'm like, well, maybe this is a different Warren Parrish. But where it was found, it seemed highly likely to me that this is this Warren Parrish.
It kind of looks 1930s to me, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, according to Heber C. Kimball, Warren Parrish admitted to embezzling $20,000. Well, if Heber C. Kimball said it, you can take that to the bank. And Joseph Smith claimed money went missing whenever Parrish handled it. He's got sticky fingers. A key trunk vanished before it could be searched. Despite being the largest shareholder, Joseph stood to lose the most, but doubled down, increasing his investment, taking out loans, and selling $5,000 in personal property to save the Safety Society. Was that enough, or did you want me to read more, Bill?
No, that's enough. That's enough. But I was just, I'll add this to this. Let me pull this off and add this to the stage. We've got this photo of Joseph Smith, and we've got that photo. It does look like it's a little newer sort of technology in that one. But that is the photo I found of Warren Parrish. So if anybody can show that that's not him, that's great. But as far as I know, that's the Warren Parrish. 1844, Heber C. Kimball meets Warren Parrish while on a mission. This is Heber C. Kimball's claim. This is 1844. This is years later. Heber C. Kimball meets Warren Parrish while on a mission. Parrish is a Baptist minister. Heber claims that Warren Parrish admitted embezzling $20,000 from the bank.
Sure he did.
When the bank only had $21,000 in coin.
Mm-hmm.
Fair.
That's just the kind of thing you admit.
Yeah. Fair still banks on this claim, no pun intended, despite it being years after the fact, and sourced it from a single account without written backup.
Heber C. Kimball is throwing shade for Joseph Smith and this bank going belly up.
Yeah.
Why would he ever admit to that? I don't believe this for a second.
Isn't it such a strange instance? In what instances apologists go, that's an old account, that's
Mhm.
secondhand, years later, just not from someone we can trust. And knowing how blatantly BS the LDS Church is in its history, really you should automatically lean the other direction. And this is a late account. This is secondhand. This is from a non-credible source.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if he met him. Maybe he met him.
Yeah.
Maybe he also confessed to the Lindbergh baby kidnapping while he was at it.
They still haven't found that kid, have they?
Well, it became a murder case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The bank was in deep trouble long before Warren Parrish took over. One should question this allegation as legit. Joseph and others were known for false accusations against enemies. Remember the lost 116 pages and that whole mess. And by the time Heber made that statement, Parrish was an enemy of the church. So he was an easy fall guy. Joseph resigned because of the bank's failure. The writing was on the wall, and Parrish was never charged of anything at the time, in spite of Joseph Smith claiming he had a strong hunch that Parrish was stealing money after the fact. That's what Joseph said.
Whose fault was it that those 116 pages got lost anyway?
Yeah. Those bad, evil designing men.
It's Martin Harris. It's not
Yep.
Joseph Smith's fault. It's always somebody else.
Always. The Kirtland Safety Society, the stock ledger book and bank failure. This came out of that. I'll just note here, Warren Parrish was a teller of the bank, and a number of other men who had apostatized were officers. They took out of its vault, unknown to president or cashier, Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith, $100,000. Now see how the amounts always change, what's going on always changes, and sent their agents around. Because of course, Warren Parrish, as a teller at the bank, is going to take $100,000 of the money, and he's going to just on his own, he's going to go around among the brethren to purchase their farms, their wagons, their cattle, their horses, and everything to get a hold of. The brethren would gather up this money and put it into the bank, and those traders would steal it and send it out to buy again. And they continued to do so until the plot was discovered and payment stopped. And it's that darn Warren Parrish. He was doing that without us even knowing. It seems like what's being said here is that the scheme was to get money because people are buying the stocks, to take that money instead of holding it as backing for the bank, take that money out and buy land, buy property. Then those people would bring those notes back to the bank, and the bank would have the money again, and then it would go back out and buy more land and more things.
Mhm.
And it seems like that could not be pulled off if the president and cashier, namely Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith, didn't know about it.
Well, that's the problem. You see, they left in June, so they didn't know this going on with Warren Parrish that they put in those positions in order to trust them and make the bank work. How they can't be responsible for what they wouldn't know.
Yeah, like that murder plot that happened a few slides ago. Joseph Smith accused Parrish of taking 25 grand. Another place said 20,000. An editorial in the New Church magazine, August 1838, Elders Journal. This is Smith speaking. Warren Parrish, had the handling of large sums of money, and it was soon discovered that after the money was counted and laid away and come to be used and counted again, that there was always a part of it missing. This being the case repeatedly, and those who owned it, knowing that there was no other person but Parrish who had access to it, suspicion of necessity fixed itself upon him. By the way, it would be very convenient for Joseph Smith to say $25,000 when others claimed it was only 20 grand. And notice, by the way, it's either Heber C. Kimball learns it on a mission, or Joseph Smith is saying it after the fact.
Mhm.
Otherwise, everything else is hearsay, taking their two statements and then reiterating them again.
So this story is difficult to believe on its face, because what it requires us to believe is that they were seeing the fact that money was going out, was being unaccounted for, that they knew that Warren Parrish was the only person who could have done it. And yet they waited until it had happened over and over again until finally $25,000 had been taken before they finally did something about it. That's why I think this story is difficult to believe.
And only after Joseph Smith resigned and walked away from the church, or
Yeah.
from the bank, I mean.
To make, yeah.
So we've already got that part. We already talked about the bank in big trouble. All right, so now we're to the closing of the bank. I'm sorry, folks, for going long. We wanted to make sure that we covered this in a way that we didn't leave any major points out. June 1837, the Kirtland Safety Society was insolvent.
Really, by June? Because that's when Joseph Smith left. So I'm wondering if that's technically correct, because that would be important if it is.
Yeah, he left and it's insolvent. November 1837, it officially closes. The collapse left hundreds with worthless banknotes and heavy losses. Critics saw it as an illegal wildcat bank doomed to fail. Believers blamed bad timing and persecution. In reality, multiple factors contributed: underfunding, opposition, lack of a charter, and the financial panic of 1837.
Mhm.
None of those have anything to do with the righteousness of the saints. And it's a weird thing for God to go, you saints behave, this is going to work. And then Warren Parrish single-handedly ruins it for everyone.
Yes, or you guys need to behave yourself, or I'm going to punish the entire country with this huge panic. It's just strange to understand any way that has to do with the righteousness of the members and the wrath of God.
So now we're to the aftermath, and I'm going to open up the call-in studio. So I'm going to post the number here. So 662-667-6667. If anybody wants to join in the studio, I'm going to post that link in the live chat. And I'll post the number there too as soon as this comments go through. So 662-667-6667. And the show, the call-in part of the show has started, so you can call that number now if you do want to do that. All right, the aftermath. RFM, do you mind reading the next couple of slides, and then and I'll jump in where I need to, but if you'll read them, and then I'll get the call-in studio running while you're doing that.
How many members did the church lose? 1/3 of the leaders of the church apostatized due to the bank failure, and about 1/8 of the church members separated from the church. So around 375 out of 3,000 church members. Now remember that back around 2010, the church historian at the time, Marlon Jensen, famously said at a speech he was giving, I don't think he knew he was being recorded, but he still said it, that there are so many people leaving the church today, i.e. in 2010 when he was speaking, that there has never been a time when there have been more members leaving the church, not since the days of Kirtland have this many members been leaving the church. And this is what he was talking about.
I'll just jump in here really quick, RFM. There, I wanted to actually pull that up. So give me just a second here.
Was it 10 or 11? I think it was 10.
So this is, let's see here, add to stage. Modern apostasy. At the invitation of Utah State professor Philip Barlow, Jensen held a Q&A with a Mormon studies student group on November 11th, 2011. Jensen was asked if church leaders were aware that members were discovering problems with the LDS church history through the internet, and what is to be done for those who may be affected or who are already leaving in droves. Jensen responded that top church leaders, this is Wikipedia, by the way, that top church leaders, quote, realized that maybe since Kirtland, we've never had a period of it. I'll call it apostasy, like we're having right now, largely over these issues, unquote. Maybe since Kirtland, what he seems to be saying there, you and I talked about this the other night. It seems like what he's saying is that from his awareness that the apostasy happening in this moment in 2011 is of similar magnitude to the apostasy that happened in Kirtland, 1/3 of leaders, 1/8 of members, that Jensen isn't sure if it's less or more than that apostasy in terms of the effect of what was going on.
Yes, if he's speaking more than just euphemistically, in which case it's still bad enough, but if he's speaking technically, then it would mean that a whole lot of people have left the church. In fact, it would be statistically proportionate to the number of people who left in. I don't know if he was being that hyper literalistic.
And remember, the gospel topic essays came out shortly thereafter, the church addressing
Yes.
the wave of doubt and people leaving the church. So there's that. I'll let you do this one too, if you don't mind.
The Kirtland Safety Society's collapse triggered a crisis in the church, leaving many financially ruined and betrayed. In May 1837, a Kirtland apostasy unfolded, with prominent leaders like Warren Parrish, John Boynton, Luke Johnson, and Martin Harris leaving or being expelled. Half of the Quorum of the 12 sympathized with the dissenters. And Heber C. Kimball later claimed fewer than 20 people still believed Joseph Smith was a prophet. That definitely being an exaggeration to make a point, but still. Joseph denied fraud, insisting he never guaranteed success. Personally lost money and was left deeply in debt. He faced at least 17 lawsuits, over $30,000 in claims, forcing him to transfer property to Oliver Granger to manage payouts. Meanwhile, Ohio prosecuted Smith and Rigdon for running an illegal bank. Couldn't see that coming. In October 1837, both were convicted in absentia and fined $1,000. They appealed, arguing Ohio's 1816 anti-banking law was unconstitutional.
And I don't have the ending of that appeal. I don't know what ended up happening
I
with
think
that.
they abandoned it. They ended up fleeing to Missouri in January of 1837. He'll be arrested in October of 1837. He'll be in prison for 6 months. When he leaves, he'll go and join the saints who have left Missouri and gathered on the banks of the Mississippi in Illinois.
And then off to Nauvoo. In his study of the church in Ohio from 1830 to 1838, historian Milton V. Bachman noted that Joseph Smith's economic losses from the failure of the Kirtland Safety Society were greater than those of any other individual. But that's only if you pay it. While seeking to establish and then sustain the company and at the same time purchase land in Kirtland and goods for his store, he had accumulated debts amounting to approximately $100,000. Although he had assets in lands and goods that were of greater value in some respects than his debts, he was unable to immediately transform these assets into a form that could be used to pay his creditors. When you start to learn the story, RFM, you start to really figure out, because the church makes it sound one way for why the saints move from Palmyra to Kirtland to the banks from Missouri to the banks of Illinois to Nauvoo to out to Utah. And you're like, oh, we just get persecuted every step along the way. When you realize that Joseph Smith is continually running from the law and his money-making schemes, it makes a whole lot more sense. And his polygamy.
I'll tell you, when you realize that the saints got persecuted in New York, then they got persecuted in Ohio, then they got persecuted in Missouri, then they got persecuted in Illinois, then they got persecuted in Utah, it makes you start to think, maybe the problem's with the Mormons.
Or at least their leaders. Milton V. Bachman Jr. reports the financial losses of the Kirtland Bank approached 40 grand, and the losses of Joseph Smith were 100,000. Remember, the bank didn't take on any liability based on its articles of agreement. It was the stockholders who had to pay. So the bank has the small debt, and all the people around town have the big debts.
And yet, if the bank is using its money or its reserves in order to buy real estate, because they're investing too, right? Everybody's doing it, including the bank. That's where they're going to make all their money. I don't know. I don't know if that's what that's referring to. That would be an awful lot for them to have on hand. 40,000.
They never had hardly any money on hand. Sure. Joseph recorded in his history how, quote, a new year, 1838, dawned upon the church in Kirtland in all bitterness of spirit of apostate mobocracy, which continued to rage and grow hotter and hotter until Rigdon and myself were obliged to flee. I wonder why everybody's pissed.
Well, everybody's pissed at Joseph because they feel like he screwed him out of a bunch of money, and now they're all hanging out to dry. The people he borrowed the money from are pissed because they want their money back, and they're filing lawsuits against Joseph Smith. And that's what's getting hotter and hotter. So eventually he's going to have to leave town and try and get out of there because he owes so much money to so many people.
Okay. So next, some newspapers like the Painesville Republican questioned whether Ohio's banking law was even enforceable. Again, a newer law had come forward, 1824. So they were calling it obsolete and inoperative. Other unchartered banks operated without prosecution, leading many, especially LDS apologists, to argue that Smith was selectively targeted due to religious bias. Still doesn't solve the conditional promises upon the bank from God's mouth. With hostility rising, Joseph Smith and Rigdon fled Kirtland on the 12th of January, 1838, amid threats of violence and a warrant for Joseph's arrest. Rumors of them escaping with saddlebags of gold are likely folklore. Joseph left Kirtland financially ruined. They relocated to Missouri, you noted that, where the saints were gathering. Back in Kirtland, their legal appeal was never heard. Several lawsuits resulted in unpaid judgments. Pay your debts, folks. That's a thing the church was always harping on. Make sure you have your whether you were up to date in your child support impacted your temple recommend, for instance. And not that it shouldn't, but just notice the idea that you shouldn't date till you're 16. You should pay your child support. Notice the kinds of things that church leaders get to do and what members are asked to do. Oliver Granger handled what debts he could, but Kirtland's Mormon community collapsed. By 1838, only a remnant remained, and the Kirtland temple and city fell out of LDS hands. You want to take this one?
Yeah, it's just really interesting. This puts so many things in context. Like, this is why it is that the church had to finally buy back the Kirtland temple. This is how they lost it, okay, in the first place, the LDS church. The other thing is, this is why Emma Smith, when they were in Nauvoo and things were getting dicey again for all sorts of reasons, that she was very, very concerned about her financial welfare, because Joseph had really put it in peril in Kirtland, if not before that, but here as well. So she wanted to make sure that she and the children were protected. Okay. Is this, am I supposed to read this?
Yeah, if you would.
Okay. The Kirtland Safety Society's failure became a cautionary tale for Mormon financial management. Joseph Smith never attempted another bank. And in Nauvoo, he focused on other ventures like a hotel and store. And I think he sold stock for the hotel, didn't he? The Nauvoo house. You know, selling stock, that's a great way to raise money. He avoided banking, though.
Especially if you're a prophet.
Brigham Young later prioritized self-sufficiency, and when the church established Zion's Savings Bank in 1873, it did so legally and cautiously. The church's modern conservative financial approach may stem in part from Kirtland's collapse. I would think it stems more likely from the almost filing for bankruptcy in the 1960s that the church went through because they overextended themselves in chapel building. The bank's failure remains a point of theological debate. Critics cite it as evidence of fraud or prophetic failure. How could it not be prophetic failure? Okay. If we put fraud on the back burner for now and just look at prophetic failure, how is this not prophetic failure? I thought prophetic failure meant you know it's going to happen. And obviously they didn't. Claiming Joseph misled followers and prophesied success. Disaffected insiders like Warren Parrish spread accusations, but no unconditional prophecy is recorded, except for the one that Warren Parrish did record. Apologists argue Joseph acted in good faith, suffered losses himself, and faced economic turmoil and persecution beyond his control. Faithful historians view it as an understandable mistake, not a spiritual failure.
Stanley B. Kimball said the grand totals eloquently reveal the inherent weakness of the project. 200 persons subscribed to 79,420 shares worth at face value approximating $3,854,000. This was at $50 per share, which was only paid for with $20,000. That $3,854,000, because they were selling the shares at a discount, they actually only raised $20,725 in coins. Heber C. Kimball, for example, subscribed to $50,000 worth of shares for only $15 in cash. Remember, he's the one who blames Parrish. Other important Mormons paid in correspondingly small sums. Brigham Young, $7. Lorenzo Snow, $7.97. Wilford Woodruff, $5.25. Erastius Snow, $5.25. A few others, though, were able to come up with larger amounts. Remember Parley Pratt getting screwed? $102. Hiram Smith, $169. Benson Knight, $262. Emma Smith, $315. Joseph Smith Jr., $323.
Senior.
And senior, and good old W.J. Peterson at $785. Now remember, when Heber C. Kimball bought $50,000 worth of shares for only $15, he was handed $50,000 worth of Kirtland banknotes to go use in the community. Even if this only worked for a few months, what a screw job. Crazy. The Kirtland Safety Society.
And by the way,
yes.
A lot of people are getting screwed, but the people that are designated to be screwed are the people who are going to be receiving those bills from the people who bought them at face value when they're not worth, they're just pennies on the dollar.
You bought my house. You're Heber C. Kimball. You came out and you bought my home. I charged you $1,000 for my home. You gave me $1,000 in Kirtland banknotes. And, when I go to turn those into the bank, they don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
But I just sold my home. Paperwork's all been signed. The money changed hands when the deed was written, and now I don't have a house, nor do I have $1,000.
You might want to start suing somebody.
Yeah. The Kirtland Safety Society banknotes, once worthless, became valuable collector items, and genuine notes signed by Joseph Smith fetching high prices today. In late 1837, tensions nearly turned violent when Warren Parrish led an armed faction in the Kirtland Temple to oust Joseph Smith. He's pissed. I wonder why. Maybe because he got blamed for taking the money when he didn't. The confrontation stopped short of bloodshed, but revealed deep divisions within the church. The Kirtland Bank saga remains a complex chapter in LDS history. Economically, it was an ambitious but doomed attempt at financial independence. Legally, it tested 19th century banking regulations. Faithful perspectives view it as a noble but naive effort thwarted by external forces, while critics see it as a reckless scheme that lacked prophetic foresight and showed Joseph Smith to be a plotting murderer. I'll add that. Regardless, the failure had lasting consequences, testing faith, shaping church financial policies, and proving that faith and finance don't always mix. I'll tell that to the LDS Church today. They mix just fine. Yet the LDS Church endured and thrived in the banknotes that once symbolized failure, now represent resilience and historical lessons. And I'll note, those banknotes, I worked at Family Pawn Shop. We had tons of Mormon artifacts. We always had banknotes on hand. I don't know if we do currently because I don't work there now, but we always had banknotes on hand. I talked to Chris Bloxham the other day, and he informed me of two things. We'll get into both of those, but the first one is that the banknotes today, they're hard to find. He or Chris Benchmark Books, Chris Bench and Chris Bloxham, both Mormon artifact collectors, say they have not seen Kirtland Safety Society notes in quite a while. That the least desirable one, which is it has no real signature on it, it's stamped signatures of Rigdon and Smith. They go at a minimum, bad condition, stamped signatures, they go for $4,000 or $5,000. And if they're the right ones with signatures of multiple people on them, we'll get to the multiple signatures, but at least Rigdon and Smith, and then we'll add to it others here in a moment. When it has all the signatures on it, they go for about $10,000 to $15,000 each.
Wow.
So if anybody has those sitting in an attic somewhere in Utah,
we'll give you a couple bucks for them.
Now's the time. Get rid of those.
It's tough to have a lot of faith in Joseph Smith anymore. Not only could he not run a bank, he couldn't even get somebody whacked.
No. What was the actual name? By the way, how many times have you said Kirtland Safety Society Bank and someone corrected you?
The actual name was the Church of the Latter-day Saints. That also went through 3 different names.
Told you when it was the it actually wasn't a bank, brother RFM. It actually wasn't a bank. It was the Anti-Banking Society.
After it was the bank.
Yeah, after it was the bank.
First it was the bank, then it wasn't the bank, and then it became the bank again.
Yeah. The
Or
Kirtland
a
Safety
banking
Society.
company. Apparently, a banking company is not a bank. It's
No.
like when you buy the cans at the store and they say beef products, you should know that's not real beef.
The Kirtland Safety Society changed names at least twice from its founding in the fall of 1836 until its closure in the summer of 1837. Initially designated the Kirtland Safety Society Bank, and then no charter. That happened on January 2nd, 1837. The structure of the institution changed because of no charter, and it was officially renamed the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company in March 1837. The institution's name appeared in the LDS Messenger and Advocate as the Kirtland Safety Society Banking Company. In bonds, agreements, and other legal documents, the officers of the Safety Society use multiple names interchangeably, no big deal, to reference the institution. Given this degree of complexity and variety, documents relating to the institution on this website have generally been standardized to Kirtland Safety Society. That's the nice short term, covers all the bases.
This raises the question that I asked you last night. Why is Mormon history so freaking complicated? Now, I have not delved into much other than Mormon history to the depth that I've delved into Mormon history. But I can't imagine that any other area of a similar size and period of time is as complicated as Mormonism. Maybe it is, and I'd like some people out there who know to comment on this, because it occurs to me that if that's true, and I think there's some truth in it, that church history, Mormon church history, is so complicated, it's because Joseph Smith was always changing shit. He wouldn't leave anything alone, and he would change it to even contradict it in a period of months and years. So it's not just trying to learn a regular timeline. It's like trying to learn all these separate timelines that are going on at the same time and being changed at different points.
And can I just note too, along those same lines, kudos to Dan Vogel or D. Michael Quinn's another good example, who you're the brains of those guys. Dan, I'll just speak to you personally. Your brain and your research, your ability to take all the things that are happening in the church and organize them based on this was all happening at this moment, and this was all happening at that moment, and this was all happening at this moment. So for instance, D&C 111, to connect the dots and say, hey, this does apply to this story, is such a big deal that apologists want to stay away from. They want everything looked at in a vacuum unless it helps their cause. And so kudos to folks like you, Dan Vogel, who help us contextualize the entire history of the church so that we can sort of know, like, oh, this lawsuit of Ohio against, for the bank has to do with this other lawsuit with Orson Hyde saying that Joe Smith was going to murder Grandis and Newell, which is also connected to, D&C 111, which is also kudos to you guys who in the historian realm do that kind of work. It allows the rest of us to make sense of the world around us rather than the lens the church gave us, which is so limited and void of context that we can never connect the dots that are required to be connected to figure out this thing lied to you from the beginning.
Like Boyd K. Packer said, some dots shouldn't be connected.
And Vogel says, thanks. You're welcome, and a big thank you to you. Yeah, those are the dots that shouldn't be connected. Okay, let's wrap up here. We're right towards the end. I will go to the first call, then the first person in studio. Kendall, I see you there. And then I'm going to go to the second call, and then I'll get you, Danny, and that'll be it. So those will be our 4 things, and we'll end it. So if nobody else will join the show, please. All right. Was the bank based on revelation? Wilford Woodruff records in his journal on the first day that the notes were available in exchange that Joseph had said that he had had a revelation that the bank would be successful if executed on righteous principles.
Right.
And then remember, God has Joseph Smith put this entry into the front of the articles of agreement at the very back side of that, where he says, the Lord says these 3 verses of scripture, and bring all your coinage and bring your silver and bring your gold.
Right.
When you combine all of it together, the bank would be executed upon righteous principles. Later in the Later in a meeting on September 3rd, 1837, when John F. Boynton will bring up this very question of, well, quote, well, the bank was founded on revelation. How could it fail? Joseph will correct him and say, I never said that. I said that it had to be conducted on righteous principles, and it was not.
And that's where he wants to blame Warren Parrish, who didn't become the cashier until June of 1837 when Joseph Smith jumped ship.
B.H. Roberts says the Kirtland Safety Society enterprise ended disastrously. Having no state charter, the notes of the society had no legal standing as currency and were soon rejected by its creditors in New York, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland, where merchandise for the stores in Kirtland had been purchased on credit in large quantities, for which the society, its notes being rejected, was unable to pay. Prices in real estate rapidly declined so that large farms purchased by the society on credit and platted for a city could not be sold but at great loss. And the financial disasters that had swept over a whole country, still paralyzing all branches of business activity, the Kirtland Safety Society failed with thousands of other business concerns of 1837 and involved many members of the church in financial distress. He seems to say it was destined to fail from the beginning. We don't even need to impose some conditional revelation. And I'm tired of giving Joseph breaks on conditional revelations anyway.
I just decided that actually, when you look at church history, it's the same thing as Book of Mormon translation. And you've got the tight translation theory when God's really in charge and working on every letter and every word. And then you got the loose translation when God's sort of laying back and letting Joseph take the laboring oar. I think that over and over again, like instances such as the Kirtland Anti-Banking Society, that's the loose translation version of Mormon history.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to get off track here, but tight translation, right? Loose translation, right? And then don't forget there's also the expansion theory, which allows for parts of Joseph Smith's own life and milieu to make its way into the Book of Mormon also.
That's right. Right. The loose translation is usually brought in when everything's going to shit.
Yeah, you cover all your bases with those three, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make sense. Loose translation. We don't understand these words. We can't figure this out. Tight translation. Joseph's father's dreams in the book. Expansion theory. All included. All right, Kirtland banknotes. It said here when I first saw this, it was 3,000 to 12,000, but that's gone up. Collectors, again, Chris Bloxam and Chris Bench both know this really well. 4,000 or 5,000 minimum for a really bad one. 10,000 to 15,000 on the high end. The ones that are 15 are the ones that Brigham Young repurposed when he got to Utah. So it said earlier in our slideshow that Brigham Young, when he started a bank, he did so the legal way. Whatever that reference was, it was not the full truth. When Brigham Young gets to Utah, they need to have some currency. So they pull out all those old worthless Kirtland banknotes, and all they do is countersign them. So over top of Rigdon and Joseph Smith's signatures is Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, the guy who we blame Warren Parrish from, other than Joseph Smith. Because if we had Joseph Smith just against Warren Parrish's word, it seems so obvious at this point you'd side with Joseph or with Warren Parrish. The only reason you might lean, even as a believer, is because Heber C. Kimball says this other thing about meeting Parrish on a mission. But Heber C. Kimball is still part of the church leadership, and he sure as hell can't have Joseph Smith taking the fall.
Well, hopefully by the time they're out there in the territory, they actually have some silver and gold to back these notes.
Maybe. Brigham Young does become a millionaire and has a pretty nice set of homes, doesn't he? I'll just note, if you do have any Kirtland Safety Society notes, these are the ones you really, really want to have, the countersigned ones. So there's that. And that is the end of the show tonight, other than some phone calls and some guests. Anything else you want to say before we sort of go to those? RFM?
Yeah, I want to ask you. You've delved into this greedily and too deep. So what's your opinion? Was it simple incompetence or was it a scam?
It's been a fraud from the beginning. I have no way to see this than this was a money-making scheme that as long as everything went right, we're all going to make some money off this thing. and things didn't go right. And they never do with Joseph Smith. The church is successful, but only after Joseph Smith's life. Everything, the phrase, the cliche, everything he touched turned to gold. With Joseph Smith, it's the opposite. Everything he touched turned into a lawsuit, prison time, jail time, diddling little kids, effing up a bank that's an anti-bank because he can't get a charter, Book of Abraham, Book of Mormon.
Even when they get to Nauvoo and they have a period of peace, Joseph Smith, there may not be financial problems like there were in Kirtland, but now he's got to be marrying women like hell isn't having any and getting all those problems going. Then the newspaper gets published and it calls him out. And so he says, as the mayor, I'm going to issue an order, with the city council's approval, of course, to declare it a nuisance and have it destroyed in the press, the printing press, the print thrown out in the street.
Joseph Smith seems to me to be a shyster. From treasure digging to polygamy at the end. Just dishonesty, false promises, and disappointing results all along the way. All right.
It has seemed to me, looking at this, that church history, from the point of view of an apologist for the church, one who's defending the church and defending Joseph Smith, seems like an almost endless series of exercises in trying to make Joseph Smith not responsible for the stuff that Joseph Smith is responsible for. He's responsible for everything in his church. He's the prophet, for crying out loud. He's the first elder and the prophet of the church. But time and time again, things go wrong, they go wrong, they go wrong. And so what the apologist has to do is make it somebody's fault other than Joseph.
You said it as much there, but just to get you to say it specifically, where do you come down on the motivations and what this really was, this whole Kirtland Safety Society?
I'm not sure, but I really love Marvel Davis. By the way, see the sign there behind me?
Yeah, Marvel.
Featuring Marvel Davis.
Yeah.
Marvel C. Davis. What do I don't know. A lot of people were starting a bank. They needed a bank. They could have started a bank for a good reason. And then rapidly it became a really convenient thing. And they didn't know what they were doing. The thing is that they didn't know what they were doing. This thing would have failed anyway. But, I don't know. Where did the money go? When I say it, where did the gold and the silver go? That's what I'm asking.
God couldn't have picked a worse moment in Joseph Smith's life to ask the prophet to start a bank. God knew that I don't care whether you believe in predestination or foreordination. I don't give a shit. God knew that the 1837 financial crisis was well on its way. And God told those guys to start a bank and screw everybody.
Well, look, Bill, here's the simple way of looking at it, okay? We're in a ton of debt as a church. You're Sydney, I'm Joseph, okay?
More after this episode.
I know, but we're not there yet. We're in a ton of debt. We tried to find the treasure in Boston, couldn't find it, came back and we decided, hey, here's an idea. Let's start a bank, and then we can print our own freaking money and pay our debts off with the money we printed.
Yeah. How desperate are you, by the way? It's perfect, but how desperate are you that in 1836 you're like, oh man, we're in a buttload of debt. We got so much debt.
I mean, I laugh at it as if this isn't the United States federal fiscal policy.
Sure. We've got so much debt. I was in the bar last week and some pastor said something about there's a house in Salem, and he had enough to drink that he said the place. And I'm going to tell you what, I'm going to have God send some people to that address, and can't hurt.
Joseph goes,
Still doesn't find it. You have the treasure digging scryer of all treasure digging scryers.
Yeah.
The man who literally found a needle in a haystack.
Some days you're the windshield, some days you're the bug.
That's right. Thank you very much, Michael. $50. By the way, folks, if you like tonight's episode, I know Rick Bennett claims to be number one in Mormon history, but Rick Bennett couldn't touch this.
Can't touch this.
No.
Da, 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 da. Can't touch this. That's for the people falling asleep out there after 2 hours and 50 minutes.
Yeah, they don't. We always have more numbers at the end than we did at the beginning. Folks, please support the show. so we can continue for years into the future to bring you Mormon history like nobody else. Thank you, Michael, for the $50. Go to mormonismlive.org, click the donate button, send a few bucks today, and we'll just keep coming week after week with the deep dives. All right.
An hour ago, you mentioned someone on the phone.
Yeah, about an hour ago. They were 32 minutes ago.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm going to pull that call up now. Hopefully this works like it
Who is this?
sometimes does. Caller, what's the name?
Sam?
Sam?
Yes.
Sam, go ahead.
Okay?
Is that your real name or your temple name, Sam?
Real name.
Okay, go ahead, my friend.
Yeah, no, I wanted to tell you, basically, when you were talking about how, the apologists say the principles of financial prudence have always held true ever since then. I just had a story from my grandfather, who happens to be the great grandson of Parley P. Pratt. When he was in his 20s, he was there this would have been 1930, 1929, around there. But basically, there was a run on Zion's Bank.
Probably 20
and he was there. And I guess I'm looking at his journal right now. He said Anthony W. Ivins.
Yeah, he was in the first
walked
presidency.
through. This is before and it was before the bank opened that morning. And he basically calmed the crowd down and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please don't get impatient. We'll open the doors, let a few of you in at a time, finish their business, come out, and we have plenty of money for everyone." And my grandpa didn't have money in Zion's Bank, and he walked around a corner about half an hour after that, and the crowd started to disperse, and they had an armored truck pulled up to the back of that bank, and they took the money out of that bank and drove it over to another one that had another run going on.
Mm-hmm.
But they were using the members of church leadership to calm the people down.
Good idea.
Because, like every other bank,
Mm-hmm.
they needed to, keep enough cash on hand to satisfy the depositors.
Yeah, it's the scene out of It's a Wonderful Life, and not everybody has Jimmy Stewart on hand, so they have to settle for Anthony Ivins.
Yeah, and remember,
I know.
1930 is the Great Depression. So it makes perfect sense that we have this moment in time where people are doing a run on the banks, try to get their money because it is crashed. Well, thank you,
Yeah, no,
caller.
that's right. But I wanted to just thank you guys, everything you do. I love your show. I'd love to see a show about how everyone that went through the temple, they're making covenants based on what the covenants were at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And then everyone else after them makes different covenants, because it doesn't matter if you keep going. The covenants you make are just that one point in time. I don't know if you've already done that, but I would love to see a show like that.
What is the connection you're making from that? Why is that interesting to you?
It's interesting to me because what you're promising and has changed. And then even just recently with how, you covenant to God if you're the man, and then the woman covenants to obey the man, and now that's changed. Things like that. So if you went through the temple earlier, you never made that covenant. And it's specifically like you made different promises.
Every generation of Mormons has made different promises. Yes.
My generation made the true promises.
Chronologically, I know. But it would just be interesting to see that. And maybe you've already done that show. So
I can't believe you did that, Bill.
Yeah, I did this.
You're not supposed to do that.
Well, I do the other one, but you can't see it.
I do that all the time, but nobody knows.
All right. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, we've covered the temple before, but maybe at some point an episode in the whole thing. So yeah, thank you. Have a great day. All right, Kendall.
Thanks, ma'am.
How are you?
Kendall.
What do you
How you
think of
doing?
the Kirtland Safety Society?
Yeah, I'm actually really interested in what you guys can explain. I talk to a lot of people questioning and who've left the church who give the leadership of the church, Joseph Smith and modern prophets, quite a wide berth as far as like, oh, they're trying their best. They're not meaning to do any harm. But this story just undermines that so much. So how do you explain their mindset? Like, Joseph in the beginning was like, oh, this bank is, the bee's knees, so great, invest. And then he, once things goes bad, bails out and says, oh, don't engage in speculation. How do you explain his mindset of like, how does he justify this to himself, and apply that question to modern leaders as well, especially when a lot of people want to, I was at Terrell Gibbons' house when I lived in Virginia, and he's one of those that is just like, oh, they were good people, they thought they were doing the right thing the whole time type attitude.
So what's Terrell Gibbons like?
He's very nice.
Did you see Fiona too?
I did. Yeah, I didn't talk to her, but I saw her there.
Do you know if this was before or after she got silenced after speaking about Heavenly Mother at a farm-sponsored event?
I lived in Virginia in 2014, so quite a while ago.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago. So he thinks they're all great people. You can look at it that way, but I tell you, every time Joseph Smith is around, something's going haywire.
Yeah, it's all collectively. It's all explained more easily with less conjecture, less allowances, if you just assume he's scamming people from the beginning.
You know what the first chapter in the Harry Potter series is called, Kendall?
The Boy Who Lived.
Yeah. Church history, first chapter is called The Church Who Lived, because it's absolutely a miracle that this church ever lived. And in fact, I think it would not have if Joseph Smith had not died any later. If he had died any later, I think this church would have blown up along with Joseph Smith. But because he died when he did, and we know that it was John Taylor who killed him in the Carthage jail cell at the order of Brigham Young, but it's all established now, we understand that, right? That once he died, and under the hand of Brigham Young, the iron hand of Brigham Young, the church managed to survive, and today it's thriving, and it is the marvel of the financial world, at least it would be if the church actually let people know how much money it has.
And to this question of Joseph Smith had to justify it in his mind some way, even though he knew it was a scam from the beginning. Like, do you have any ideas of how he still, at the end of the day, justified it to himself?
I always think there's a band, kid. The great con artists, the ones who do it for a living, convince themselves even while they simultaneously know it's a scam. They are their most ardent believers, as well as the people who know from the inside that it's fake at the same time. That's my belief.
Yeah.
By the way, William go ahead. Finish your thought.
Yeah. To me, it's just clear that they've got to have a knowledge of what they're doing, and they just somehow push down the cognitive dissonance. But I talked to a lot of people who have left the church, and they still are like, no, the brethren are good. They're just misled and in the dark as the rest of us. They didn't know the bad stuff of history. They didn't hide anything intentionally type thing. So it just puzzles me how that can still be applied to all these leaders and Joseph Smith in the face of all this evidence.
When you think about it, it's hard to hide stuff unintentionally.
Yeah. I almost half expected when Joseph Smith wrote that thing after leaving the bank and said, this money is worth nothing. These notes are worth nothing. I expected at the end for him to say, and we consider the matter closed. Because even when the brethren today are caught with their hand in the cookie jar, having broken the law, who cares? Let's move on.
The church has not changed since its beginning. If it runs into something where the government doesn't want it to do what the church wants to do, the church is going to go ahead and do it anyway.
Yeah, that's actually the moment I decided to leave was when I read the press release about the SEC scandal and how everything was so carefully worded and how they didn't take any responsibility. And yeah, that famous ending of like, we consider the matter closed. Well, what about the rest of us? We don't consider it closed.
Joseph Smith isn't the only one who issued carefully worded denials.
Yeah. I see the through line from the modern church. Thanks for making that connection.
Absolutely. That's what I'm here for.
Well, thank you, Kendall. Thank you for joining the show.
Okay, thanks.
Take it easy.
Thank you.
All right.
Nice
now,
to see Kendall.
The next caller, what's the name, caller?
It's Josh Kim. Hey guys.
Josh, how are you?
Josh.
Good. How are you guys?
Good.
Are you guys going to the opera tonight again?
Say that again.
Are you guys going to the opera tonight again?
Are we going to the
No.
opera? No opera.
I'm not going to the
No
opera
opera.
tonight.
Okay.
Are you?
Are you going
No,
to the opera?
okay.
What do you think? What do you think of the
No,
Kirtland
just-
Safety Society?
It just seems like it seems like Joseph Smith is always telling on himself when he does things later on that sheds light on what he did earlier, because I think it was like in DNC. I can't remember what it said, but it's something like, I'm gonna butcher it because I don't have it for me, but it's like in DNC it says, we have learned by experience that when almost like all men, when they get a little authority or power,
Yep.
they exercise unrighteous dominion.
Yep. Section 121.
It's like he's talking about himself. It's like he's confessing, right? Almost. I mean, that's how I read it. Obviously he means for other people to think it's not him, right? But it's him. So it's like, and like when he gets to Nauvoo, he almost does everything like that he's supposed to kind of like not get caught almost, except he does later get caught because he can't help himself. Like he's the mayor, he's the general of the Nauvoo Legion, he's like the clerk, right? The clerk that he kind of has he wears all the hats to avoid getting caught again because he learned his lesson, right? Except
right, and the other people who fill the other positions, are his right-hand men who will do what he tells them to do, including letting him off of being arrested on warrants out of Missouri from Missouri lawmen coming to Nauvoo and arresting him.
Right. And I think polygamy is one of the reasons, the ways that he kind of makes sure that he those people are like kind of like indebted to him. He kind of, all the people, like all the wives that he marries, or they're kind of related to the wives of his cronies, right? So and like his wives are like the daughters or the sisters-in-law of Heber or Brigham, and it does make sense. I mean, I'm not saying it's entirely entirely it fits one-on-one, but that's the way it makes sense to me. But if I could leave this kind of end things with one final thought, is like, is it the dog stopper in the church? At least the way I thought of it growing up is like, God will make everything right in the next world or whatever. Like if church leaders screw up, it's because God gives people free agency, and it stops people from kind of delving into church history too deeply, right? Because if we did, then we'd be like, oh my God, then we would arrive at the same conclusion that we are tonight, right? Like, oh my God, Joseph Smith is such a scoundrel, right? And there's just no way that God would have chosen him to be a prophet, like he's such a bastard, and more people would just walk away. But
well, thank you, Josh.
Unfortunately, for some of us, after the years. Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time to compile all the stuff, so that we wouldn't have to.
Yeah, thank you,
Josh. You're welcome. The worse Joseph Smith is as a human being, the more faith it takes to believe he was a prophet.
When Josh started making the conversation RFM, it made me think in terms of. Let me grab that off the screen. Put this up. Do you know who that is? Joseph Smith.
I feel like you should know him. I don't know who is that.
Dr. Terminus from Pete's Dragon, the original Disney film.
Oh, that's why I don't know him. I've never seen that.
He travels around selling BS medicines. He's on this cart and he's got a helper with him.
He's a quacksalver.
Yep. And you can see behind him all the medicines there in the cabinet. And it's either poisonous stuff or things that don't work. Anyway, there's a line. He said, I don't want to cure anybody here. They all deserve to have whatever they have. And you're selling false promises. And Joseph Smith, from the beginning, sells false promises. And the religion today is selling false promises. But like in the day where the guy comes along selling salves and ointments and cures for cancer. Everybody has a hope that the thing will work and that it's true.
Mm-hmm.
And it just isn't. It just isn't true.
If what you need fixed is big enough, you got to hope in something.
Yeah.
I like his costume.
Yeah. It's a great costume. He's got kind of that Joseph Smith look a little bit, you know?
Yeah, look at the orange. That's my favorite color.
Yeah.
What's JD Dutra doing?
Yeah, JD Dutra, $99.99. Hey guys, what's the episode where you cover that Brigham Young had Joseph Smith killed in? First off, we didn't cover, we covered a guy making a claim that Brigham Young had Joseph Smith killed in Carthage.
I feel like I should confess that I was kidding. No, that never happened. This is look, I'm trying to be as nice as I can. I'm doing it for Lent, okay? It's not easy. There is a certain segment of the Mormon populace that has now taken to believing that Joseph Smith was not killed by a mob in Carthage. He was killed by John Taylor at the behest of Brigham Young, because Brigham Young wanted Joseph Smith out of the way so Brigham Young could practice his polygamy that Joseph Smith didn't want to practice.
I was just trying to look it up. Murder of Joseph. It was something to do with the murder
Who killed
of
Joseph Smith?
Who killed Joseph Smith? Yep. Mormonism Live, episode 116. Who killed?
So we do address that issue there. It's
Yeah.
just that we don't actually come down on the side. I say that tongue in cheek. It's like I can't bring it up because the ridiculousness of the concept lends itself to satire. So that's why I have to say it every time.
Yeah, episode 116. There it is. So you can go find that. All right. Danny, you'll be our last listener of the night who gets to join the show.
Danny, it's just a
Hi,
skeleton
guys.
there at his laptop.
What do you think of the Safety Society?
Oh man, what a story that is. You know, I'm really thankful that you guys actually covered this because it actually kind of connects into some of the family history that I've been doing. I recently discovered that I go back 10 generations since the very founding of the church. I found my very first ancestor. And the second generation, well, they joined at the same time. It was very early. And one of my ancestors who didn't make it out here was in the Ohio area and lost some money. Probably lost a lot of money in this Kirtland bank failure. And he ended up being so upset about it that he got up and said the Book of Mormon wasn't true in some meeting or something, and they voted him out. But this was the main thing. His family stayed in the church and went on to, his son helped with the Nauvoo temple and later came out here. But when it came time for everybody to migrate to Utah, he was still upset and they were hanging out in Iowa. So it's just 10, 12 years later, however much longer it was later, he's still upset about that. And his family, his son and his wife are trying to get him to come to Utah. And he says no, because, what happened in Kirtland, he was still upset about. So they just left him in Iowa. And so, I mean, that's how much this affected families even years later. So I've been trying to understand that guy and this episode, and it's just you guys just explain the whole thing, and I really appreciate it.
So it's easier to understand now why it is he would be so mortally wounded in his finances as well as his testimony.
Yes, absolutely. But it also goes to show how much power Joseph Smith and the movement still had, even over members of his name was Andrew Allen, over members of his own family, that they would still come to Utah after that all happened and leave their patriarch, the father figure that brought the family into the church all those years ago. They just leave them behind and come out here. It's just,
even though a sizable chunk left the church, the majority stayed.
Yeah.
So he's with the majority. Things like this happened after Joseph Smith died, like that whole terrible, it's not a push cart, it's a pull.
The hand carts.
Hand cart.
Yeah.
Debacle.
Yeah. And the thing
water.
is, we worship the hand carts, the hand cart people now. We have statues to them. It was one of Brigham Young's worst ideas, and we just romanticize it.
Yeah. And especially leaving way too late in the season like they did, against advice from the guy who was leading them, but with apostolic promises in the name of God that they would be protected, and they weren't. So yeah, that caused a lot of problems too.
Yeah, that's all I want to say. I just want to say thanks. You guys are just coming in with answers to my
Oh.
questions, so I appreciate it.
Well,
Thank you, Danny. Thank
Have
you
a
very
great-
much.
One of the apologetic responses is that people, only a minority portion of people left, only a minority portion of leaders, only a minority portion of members. So the people that stayed, their testimonies must mean something. And I would say not any more than those Jehovah's Witnesses who stayed along when 1914 came and passed.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus didn't come back.
In 1970, whatever it was.
Yeah.
Those Jehovah's Witnesses, they're pretty stubborn.
And those Mormons are too.
True.
And I hope, because things like this would have helped me a ton years ago to get the full story. Paul Harvey, now you know the rest of the story. With the Kirtland Safety Society Bank, you know why the church glossed over it. You know why you got so many other stories, Sweetwater River Crossing is an example, where it's a false story, but you got more information on that false story than you ever got in the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. And second, now you know the rest of the story. And for those of your believing friends and family, maybe this is a beautiful chance to share this with them and help them see that things aren't shared for a reason. But I hope that tonight's episode was helpful on whatever side of the aisle you're on in helping you have more information to make informed decisions. That is the Kirtland Safety Society. Any last words from you, RFM?
I think it was a great show, and I'm glad you took the charge of doing it. You did a great job, and I learned a lot in the process.
Yeah, and we went an hour and 13 minutes longer than we ever, well, I shouldn't say ever, but we normally do. So catch us Friday. We'll probably follow up a little bit on this on Mormonism After Dark. We'll talk about the Danites, get a few things that RFM has had going on in his life through the week, and we'll have a lot of laughs doing it. So join us Friday at 8 p.m. for Mormonism After Dark. See you for the newscast at 6 Monday. Otherwise, we'll see you back here for Mormonism Live next week, 6:20 Mountain Time. Thank you, everyone. Good night.